The only firearm left with ammunition was Dave's .45, which he was hanging on to. Roger drew his saber and thrust its tip into the closest target's head. Dave took his axe in two hands and swung the back edge of its into the next, fracturing its skull. Each of the survivors was bashing away with blunt and blade instruments, with all the energy and will they had left in the world. Glass smashed as the horde's numbers kept increasing, and the sheer weight of the creatures was forcing them through the gaps. "It's no good. We have to fall back," Dave shouted. "To where?" Roger shouted back to him. "Upstairs, all of you, now!" Dave yelled. They quickly abandoned their positions, but as Steve turned, a creature took hold of his jacket and pulled him through the window, the horde wrenching him into the mass of creatures and beyond sight. There was nothing any of the survivors could do for him now. The 4 islanders that were left reached the staircase as the first zombies were already tumbling through the windows. "What do we do?" cried Katie. "Into that room!" shouted Roger. It was the upstairs lounge, the large lockable door. They ran inside, shutting it behind them. Roger turned the key. They could already hear the sound of the creature's dirty footsteps coming up the stairs. "What the fuck do we do, Dave?" asked Tommy. "Seriously, you're asking me to know, like I have any fucking clue?" The horde began beating on the door. It was a sturdy door, but with enough creatures in time, it would fall. "What options do we have?" asked Roger. "Get fucked, that seems about it," said Dave. "That's bullshit! I refuse to accept that and just lie down and die," cried Katie. Dave threw a chair across the room in anger. Roger instead sat down and thought. Thought about what they could do with their final time and energy. "We will not survive the night in this room, so either we die here or try to make a break for it." "And go where? I've lost everyone. There's nothing left," said Tommy. "We have our boats at the jetty, and that yacht too," said Roger. "And where will we go, Roger?" Tommy asked again. "Surely anywhere's better than dying here." "Is this going to be our lives until the day we die? Running until we're either killed by those monsters or die of starvation?" "Those indeed sound like the options, Tommy." "Well, I would rather live as many days as I can, not die by those bastards," shouted Katie. "Right. Sounds like we're making a break for it then," said Dave. "All agreed?" asked Roger. "Yes," Katie shouted. "Yeah," said Tommy. "So, got any wise ideas on how to do that?" asked Dave. "Anyone got any ammo left?" asked Roger. Dave slammed the .45 down on the table. "Just this. 7 rounds." "Right, then that's our ticket," said Roger. "How so?" asked Dave. "Can you get onto the roof from here?" Roger asked him. Dave suddenly thought. He went to the window and pulled the curtains across. "The ladder's still up from earlier, just outside the window." "Right, then we need a volunteer to use the gun. They climb up onto the roof and draw as many creatures to the other side of the building as possible with that gun and harsh words. The rest of us make a dash down the ladder once it's been clear as it can be," said Roger. "You think that'll work?" asked Tommy. "Well, unless you've got any better ideas, it's about our only chance." "All right, I'll go onto the roof. You just be ready," said Dave. "Good luck," said Roger. Dave opened the window and looked down below. There were a few creatures towards the bottom of the ladder, but most were around the front and the other side of the house. Fortunately, they'd been paying so much attention to the ground floor that they hadn't noticed him yet. He hauled himself onto the ladder and scurried up onto the roof, the Colt in his belt, an axe slung on his back with a rope. He crept carefully along the inward-sloping roof until he reached the other side, being careful not to attract any attention until he was in position. He leapt up onto the edge of the roof and stood up in plain view. "Hey, motherfuckers! That's right, you ugly bastards!" he shouted. The horde immediately looked up to the source of the new noise. Unable to avoid the sight and sounds of living flesh, some of them began reaching for him, a full 30 feet below. He pulled the Colt from his belt and held it up, kissing the sight. "Hello, my friend. Guess this'll be your last fight." He cocked the handgun and took careful aim with 2 hands. He needed to attract attention, but that was no reason to waste the ammunition. The first shot rang out, and the creature's head snapped back as the powerful .45 round struck its head and killed it instantly. "That's right, bitches. Time for one last party." He took aim with the second shot, killing another instantly. "Hell yeah. How you like that?" he screamed. Roger carefully crept up to the window that Dave had climbed out to look down below. There were now just 5 zombies near the base of the ladder. He looked back at Katie and Tommy. "Right. Only a few left down there. I suggest we get moving. It's going to be a fight to get free, but it's probably the best chance we get." "All right. I'll go first." "Good lad. Katie, you'll be second. I'll go last. We're going to have a fight our way out." "What about Dave?" asked Katie. "He'll be out of ammunition by the time you reach the ground. I'll wait here until he's down and be the last one," said Roger. Tommy climbed out of the window and got onto the ladder, the hatchet hanging from his belt. He climbed down with a few feet of the ground. The first creature was just below. He kicked it in the head, sending it tumbling down, before jumping to the ground. He pulled the hatchet from his belt. "Right, you scum. You're getting some." Katie got onto the ladder as Tommy swung his hatchet at the first beast. The horde at the front of the building was still largely focused on Dave as he fired his last 2 shots. "I'm coming down, you bastards!" shouted Dave. He stepped down from the ledge and out of view before stepping quietly across the roof. Peering over the edge, he could see that Tommy was hacking away with his hatchet as Katie was just reaching the base of the ladder. He jumped on and began climbing down quickly, reaching the window where Roger was waiting. "Good job! Now get on down. I'll be right with you," said Roger. The edge of the horde was already taking notice of Tommy's exploits, enthusiastically fighting like a fanatic, spewing blood everywhere. Katie lifted her hammer and joined the fight as Dave reached the bottom of the ladder. "Roger, get down here," Dave barked. Dave took his axe from his back and into his hand, picking out his first target as Roger climbed onto the ladder. Dave lifted his axe and smashed down the back edge on his first target, the skull fracturing and collapsing under the heavy weight of the weapon head. Tommy spun around and smashed his hatchet into the face of a zombie, sending it flying into the base of the ladder. The ladder quickly gave way, and Roger screamed out before he hit the ground hard, his head striking the stone on the landing. "Roger!" Katie shouted. She ran over to his body, but blood was already pouring from the open wound in his skull. "He's gone, Katie," Dave said. The 2 turned around to see Tommy hack another down. The 3 stood up and looked ahead. The entire horde now surrounded them and was already stumbling closer, uncountable odds. Blood dripped from the survivors' weapons and sweat from their brows. They were tired of fighting, tired of surviving, but never willing to give up. They all knew it was hopeless, but their bloodlust would at least be fulfilled in one last fight. "Fuck these zombies! Give 'em hell!" Dave bellowed. The last 3 islanders lifted their weapons and stormed towards the mass, swinging with all the force and energy they had left in the world, until blood ran in rivers and they breathed their final breaths, content in the knowledge that they'd given it everything they had. Another islander fell, another triumph for the dead, and a crushing defeat for the living. With Dave's last dying thought, all he could think was perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps they always were on the losing side. But at least in his life in the last 10 years had contained more excitement and adventure than sitting in a miserable office doing pointless work. Though it was only a shame that no one would be left to record his life, to document the fact that he'd been more than just an office clerk. He finally laid to rest in peace, knowing he would soon become one of them, thankful to have all the worries in his life finally over, but hating his enemy no less. Chapter 10. English-Welsh Border, United Kingdom. Nick had been resting for no more than an hour when the scream woke him. He sat up, instinctively grabbing for his machete that was always within arm's reach. The room was still dark, though a few low-level lights provided a little illumination near the serving area. From the few windows still remaining, a very dull yellow was starting to enter as the first rays of the sun arrived. He could see the shapes of several people moving slowly. His first instinct told him this was trouble, and he quickly moved towards the sign of danger, holding his weapon out in front, ready to strike. As he took another step closer, a wail came from the surface of the unit, and he immediately spotted one of the wounded passengers. 2 of the others were holding the man down. "What's going on?" asked Nick. "We think he's been bitten," said Jessica, whilst continuing to hold the man down. "Why do you think that?" asked the suspicious Nick. "Well, for a start, look at his skin. He has a fever. His skin is pale, but worse than that, he won't let us look at his wound." Nick stepped around the group, looking at the trapped man. She was correct. He did have the symptoms of either a nasty fever or a bite. Either way, it needed to be decided, and decided fast. He stepped up to the man. "Listen, I'm taking a look. Either you let us, or we'll do it by force. You know the risks we all take." He reached out, and the man started to struggle, swinging his arms and managing to strike Jessica on the side of the head. She collapsed, stunned by the strike. "Right, enough," growled Nick as he delivered a quick punch to the man's head. As the man rolled about unconscious, the 2 other passengers helped pull open his jacket to reveal a dark stain of blood. "Come on, we need to get this off," Nick ordered. As they pulled off his clothes, the injury told them all they needed to know. The blood was thicker than normal, and the flesh around it was already looking dead. "Fuck," swore Nick. "How many times have we been through this?" Gary appeared, the sound having woken him, and on seeing the trouble, he pulled out his machete. He looked at Nick, giving him a look that told him exactly what he intended to do. Nick nodded, and then moved away, feeling exhausted and just a little let down by the single biggest problem they had ever faced: hidden infection. "It's okay. Get some more rest. It's being taken care of," he said as he slumped back down to rest. There were murmurs as the wounded person was taken out of the room, but after all they had faced, there were no voices of dissent. Nick lay down and allowed himself to close his eyes for a while. It was slightly less dark now, and the sun was about to cast its rays across the old service station. He'd been awake for only a few minutes, but Nick already stood at the front of the group. In one hand, he held a map, and in the other a detailed list of supplies. He paused whilst looking at the haggard survivors. "I'll give you the facts, and we'll vote on the plan, right?" he asked, as though they had a choice. A low murmur was the only reply. "Adam, what's our status?" Adam stepped forwards, though he looked a little nervous addressing the group. "Right. The bus has had it. I might go another mile, but it's basically trashed. The other 4 vehicles have enough space for us, but only just. We have enough fuel for maybe 30 miles, if we take them all, or we can get about 150 miles with just one. But only a small group can do that. We have enough food and water for 4 or 5 days. From what we've picked up here, we have a decent amount of ammunitions and weapons," he said, before returning to his position. "That isn't so great. Options-wise, we are limited. The way I see it, we have 3 options, and I don't like any of them," said Nick. "Let me guess, one's to stay here and party?" asked Max with a sarcastic expression. "Not quite," answered the irritated Nick. "The first option is we load up the vehicles and head further in the country. We can't travel far, and there's no guarantee we'll find anywhere better. The second option is to head to the coast. We're about 20 miles from the sea. If we can find a boat, we can try and go somewhere else." "A boat? To where?" shouted one of the group. They were followed by murmurs of complaints from some of the others. "As I said, I don't like any of these options, but we have to do something. The third option is to dig in here and send out one vehicle to scout for something better. We could send them to one town or city at a time, or even to the coast to find a boat," he continued. "What about option 4? asked Zach. "That's it, I'm afraid, unless any of you have some better ideas," answered Nick. The group broke out into almost simultaneous discussion and argument as they debated the different options or lamented on the lack of them. Zach, Adam, Gary, Jessica, and Max approached Nick. "I'm for the coast plan. This whole area's fucked, and I mean fucked. Does anybody seriously think we can find somewhere safe, here, where we couldn't hold on to the green zone?" asked Zach. "He's got a point for a change," said Gary. "If we get there and can't find a boat, we'll be well and truly screwed," said Max. "Yeah, but if we send one truck, we risk only a part of the group and can still try something else," said Jessica. "In theory, I'd agree, but we are so few. I'm inclined to go for a plan that will maximize our chances. Surely we should decide on a single strong plan with at least a chance of success. Otherwise, if we're timid, we'll get worn down and picked off, till there's none of us left," said Nick. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Nick," said Jessica. "Look, nothing personal, Jessica. It's just my opinion. In my experience, we've been fighting in this area for years. And what have we achieved?" "Well, after 10 years, there are still some of us left. That has to mean something." Nick nodded in agreement. "Yeah, very true. We can't be completely wrong," said Zach. "Any other ideas?" asked Nick. A loud crash came from the back of the building, against the far wall, and the single sound stopped all conversation. The sound was almost immediately followed by the noise of glass breaking and screaming coming from the toilet side of the building. "Get ready," shouted Nick, as he pulled out his machete and rushed to the window and the direction of the first noise. As he reached within a few feet, he could make out shapes moving near the glass. They're here. Watch the windows. Gary, take a group and check the vehicles out front, he ordered. As Gary and a group of 4 rushed to the front entrance, the rest of the survivors drew a variety of weapons. Every single person in the group carried something dangerous. It was a simple fact of life after 10 years of being on the run. A creature pulled itself through the shattered window, only to receive 2 swift strikes from the women nearby. As the zombie collapsed, it was finished off with the mace to the head by Max. Another window crashed, and 3 more of the undead tried to enter the eating area. Again, they were quickly halted by the defenders. "Max, you manage the defense here. I need to check the back," said Nick as he signaled to Zach and Adam. As the little group made to move, they were joined by Jessica, who was carrying a dull, pitted-looking katana. It had been a present years before, and though it looked rough, it was one of those rare modern reproduction swords that was actually designed for cutting as opposed to hanging on the wall and looking pretty. "I'm coming with you," she explained as she tagged along to the rear of the small party. Nick moved to the center of the building where a number of weapons and supplies had been piled up ready to be loaded onto the vehicles. He looked to his left in the direction of the toilet area. There was a dark trail of blood along the floor that had definitely not been there when they arrived just hours before. Jessica lowered herself down to look more closely, but experience told her not to touch the liquid. She sniffed before sighing. "It's fresh, and it's human. Somebody has an injury, and my guess is they've been hiding out in there," she said with a sound of dread in her voice. Nick signaled for the 3 to follow him as he approached the door to the toilet area. It was the same spot that they'd cleared earlier, when the small number of undead had been waiting behind the door. He opened it slowly, half expecting to see another group of creatures, but instead, all that could be seen was a body in the middle of the room, face down and surrounded by blood. "Holy shit!" shouted Adam as he spotted the body. They moved in slowly, Jessica watching the rear as they moved into the room. There were no signs of forced entry and no signs of a struggle. Nick leaned down, his machete at the ready, and checked for signs of life. "Anything?" asked Zach. Nick twisted his head before reaching out and rolling the body over, before jumping back in case the body turned on him. It was safe, though, and the body was still. "Who is it?" "Not one of our group. It must be somebody who was hiding out here." "Where, though?" asked Nick. A series of gunshots came from inside the eating section, presumably from the recently discovered weapons and ammunition. "Come on, we need to get back to the others," said Nick. "What about him?" asked Adam, as he looked down at the body of the unfortunate soul. "You know the drill. We can't leave a body like this behind." "Very true," replied Adam, as he lifted up his mace before giving Nick one last glance. Nick nodded in agreement, and then turned for the door. Without pausing, Adam brought the weapon down hard onto the man's head, the heavy mace easily smashing deeply into the skull and brain. It was messy and violent, but a guaranteed way to avoid seeing him again as a walking piece of carrion. They left and moved back into the center of the building where they were met by Gary. "The vehicles are fine, but this place isn't safe. We can see movement in the trees all around us. I think we should bug out and fast. They'll be in the parking area in less than 5 minutes at this rate." "At the front, maybe. At the back, they're already in. Come on, we need to go," said Nick. The whole group rushed back into the eating area, where all hell had broken loose. Zombies were pouring in from 3 breaches in the windows and walls, though so far they could see no injuries to their defenders. Whilst most of them joined the battle, Nick and Gary held back, looking quickly around. "If we're going to leave, we should do it now. Another minute and we'll be surrounded," said Gary. Nick nodded, thinking quickly whilst further blasts and shouts indicated the ferocity of the ongoing fight. Another window shattered, and 2 zombies pushed inside. Gary barged his riot shield into them, whilst Nick and Zack hacked and stabbed, quickly putting the 2 to the ground. Through the new gap in the perimeter, Nick could see the shapes heading towards him. "Right, we leave, and I say we head for the marina. Agreed?" he shouted. "Fuck yeah," answered Gary, whilst Zack simply nodded. "We're leaving!" shouted Nick loudly, though only those nearest to him could hear. Nick grabbed Max and shouted so he could be heard over the din of the fight. "Get the vehicle started. We'll leave in 30 seconds. Got it?" Max nodded and quickly grabbed some of the people around him and made for the front of the building. Nick, Zack, and Gary worked around the group, providing help where needed, but more importantly, telling them to grab their supplies and to head for the parking area. In just seconds, most of them were heading for the front, leaving Nick, Zack, Gary, and Jessica in the middle of the room. One of the older men turned, noticing how few were providing the rear guard. More glass shattered as a dozen zombies pulled themselves inside. "Go!" Nick shouted. "Make sure all the vehicles are ready. We'll follow soon," he barked. The 4 fighters took steps back, giving themselves a little more time before the undead reached them. Nick looked over his shoulder. He could see the people loading gear into the trucks and climbing aboard, but over half were still not out the front door, and they obviously needed more time. Even 20 seconds would help. "Come on, they need time," shouted Nick, as he slashed at the nearest zombie, his sharp machete easily slashing the hand from the wrist. They were hit on 3 sides, but their skills and experience helped them stand firm and concentrate on watching each other's flanks, whilst they worked quickly and methodically. Gary and Zack were now both carrying shields, and with these they could block bites and flailing strikes, whilst Nick and Jessica dealt the killing blows. Something must have caught Zack, because his feet were pulled out from under him, making him fall flat onto his front. Jessica twisted around, spotting a large creature with almost no discernible clothes on, his body bearing down on Zack. With a quick slash, she brought her katana down from her shoulder and slashed from collar to thigh. The cut was deadly, and almost split the thing in half. She reached down to help Zack, and was almost struck herself by another that reached out to grab her. Luckily for Jessica, Zack was able to pull out his emergency pistol, a vintage 17th century wheel-lock pistol that he'd borrowed from the town's museum. It was a beautiful work of art, and to all intents and purposes looked like a traditional muzzle-loading pistol. It was fitted with complicated clockwork mechanism that allowed it to be fired without flint or burning match cord. It made a few clicks, and then a bright yellow flash, followed by a huge cloud of white smoke that engulfed the group. The pistol was loaded with heavy, half-inch wide lead ball, and it could easily smash a zombie back a good distance. With the smoke providing cover, they retreated to the entrance, though they still had to hack and stab at anything that reached too close to them. Once outside, Nick was pleased to see the 4 vehicles were fully loaded up, and a good number of passengers were armed and waiting on the roofs and windows to fight off any threats. "Why can't we go anywhere nice?" asked Jessica with a grin. Nick gave a strained smile before heading for the Land Rover. "Come with me. We need to go," he shouted as he pulled open the driver's door. As he jumped in, the other 3 opened the doors and jumped in also. Before they could pull away, a series of blasts came from the vehicle's mounted firearms. Gary had always been on the Bren gun fitted to the Land Rover, and its heavy bullets smashed into the zombies exiting the service station. The engine was already running, and Nick simply dropped it into gear, hit the lights, and started to move away. As the lights came on, he saw the true horror of their situation. The entire vehicle parking area was full of hundreds of the walking dead. Where they had come from he couldn't fathom, but they were so thick he was immediately worried they would be swamped. "Zack, I need the route to the coast, ideally the marina near the docks. We need to avoid the B roads if the motorway is anything to go by." Zack was already on it. "Out through the main entrance, back onto the circular, and then take the south dual carriageway." "On it," said Nick, as he swung the steering wheel and headed for the entrance road and the horde. Though he had the snowplow fitted, he knew from experience that he had to judge the speed right. Too slow and they would be bogged down by the dead. If the undead could surround the rear of them, then the rest of the convoy would be trapped. The Land Rover was the only vehicle that had the torque and horsepower to push through them. If he went too fast, though, he risked damage or losing control, and a crashed Land Rover was a meat wagon. Timing as well as he could, he moved up a gear and braced himself for the inevitable smash. As the blade hit the first few zombies, there was a light shudder. The heavy iron mass easily tore open the frail undead, yet more were behind. As he smashed through the first dozen, he could feel the vehicle slowing. Revving the engine, he did his best to keep up the power, whilst the passengers fired weapons and hacked and stabbed from the windows with anything they could find. With one great jolt, they slammed through the last 4 undead and were released onto one of the debris-strewn roads. Nick looked over his shoulder, spotting the lights from the rest of the vehicles close behind. The column of blood-spattered trucks moved off clockwise along the circular road until reaching the slip road leading to the wide dual carriageway. It was similar to the road that they had arrived on, though it had far less abandoned vehicles on it. This was probably due to the mass exodus in the early days when people deserted the cities and headed deeper into the country to try and escape. It was ironic, but they were now heading to the exact opposite direction to those early survivors. The city was the capital of this region, and 10 years ago had a thriving population of over 250,000 people. Now, the city blocks were derelict and overgrown. Few of the survivors in the Green Zone had seen it for years. It was now simply known as the city, and only a fool would try to enter. The multi-lane road, though devoid of substantial debris, was littered with tiny groups of the undead. And as the convoy raced past them, they stopped what they were doing and started to head in the same direction as the smoke-bellowing trucks. "How far to the marina?" asked Nick as he reduced speed, always conscious of the excessive fuel consumption and risk of damage when moving too quickly on these roads. About 12 miles, I think, assuming we can take the flyover. Otherwise, we'll need to add about another 3 miles, replied Zack. 15 miles. We got enough fuel for that, right? Nick asked. Yeah, we calculated about 30 miles left, so we should do it with spare in the tanks. Great. Let's just hope there's something useful at the marina. We're going to need something pretty big for all these people, snapped Nick. Don't worry. Last time we were there, I'm sure there was still plenty of old boats lying around. There's one possible problem, though. Which is? Before Zack could answer, a large, dark object came rushing out from the side of the road and slammed in hard against the Land Rover. The shock of the impact threw the Land Rover onto its side. The passengers were thrown about as the vehicle slid along the road several 100 yards before coming to a stop. Nick pulled on the door handle and swung it open to reveal several fires outside and lots of shapes moving. A volley of gunshots and shouting were the last thing he heard before passing out. Chapter 11. Resolution Island, Five Fingers Peninsula, New Zealand, 6 a.m. Bruce lay back in his chair and propped his feet up on the outer wall of the tower he was sitting in. The wooden structure formed the tallest structure of their wall. He didn't have to be on guard or even awake, and the very idea of seeing the sunrise was completely alien to him just a few years previously. Long having involuntarily given up alcohol due to its rarity and having bigger responsibilities, being awake to see the fresh new morning was an experience he had grown to enjoy. Looking out across the causeway, which joined their guarded community to the mainland, the sun began to light the small open plain divided by their man-made river. The causeway was the only land joining them to Resolution Island, and they had been quick to dig a trench to split the two, effectively making them their own island, only ever joined by a simple swing bridge that had not been in use for 2 years. They had lights running the length of their wall, powered by batteries that were charged by wind and solar power. But they only kept the lights for emergencies, knowing that they attracted the hordes. The island of Resolution before the Zompok was only inhabited by wildlife, but had quickly become a site of refuge during the crisis. The government had evacuated many women and children here, but within months the main island had fallen. The remaining survivors fled to the Five Fingers Peninsula, being 8 kilometers long by a kilometer wide, on the southwest coast of the country. This bottleneck had kept the community safe for many years, but with the ever threat of the main island's inhabitants, no one knew how many creatures were there, but all were quite sure that the zombie population was likely spanning the tens of thousands. The single town they had established on the island had a perimeter wall, but everyone knew that if the creatures ever reached it in large numbers, it would be their end. The crew of Bruce and the road train had traveled to this isolated community 3 years after the zombie outbreak, shortly after making radio contact in New South Wales, Australia. The Five Fingers Peninsula had since been renamed Resolution Island, the community doing their utmost to forget the horrors that had overcome the rest of the land mass. The population was just over 400, many being women and children under 12. Of the entire population, only 8 were competent fighters, a mix of the original colonizers and Bruce's group. Among the population were people with a wide variety of skills, from farmers to scientists, a broad enough section to continue with human civilization. Taking a sip of his lukewarm water, Bruce looked out as the daylight uncovered a single creature milling around by the causeway. He casually took another sip, and then placed his glass down on the floor of the tower, picking up the crossbow that was propped against the wall. Firearms had long since become useless, the last handful of their ammunition being stored for a rainy day. Bows and crossbows had become the commonplace with the survivors, who practiced on a weekly basis. Still sitting in his chair, Bruce wound the crank on the crossbow until it was fully cocked, loading on a bolt as he looked at his target. For Bruce, seeing a zombie now was no real cause for concern. Not like it used to be. The causeway separating them from the mainland was just 200 feet wide, and protected by 3 layers of defenses. There were 30-foot gaps between each ring wall, and only a single entrance to each barrier. Every islander knew how absolutely vital the nature of their defenses were and their relation to their survival. Taking aim down the open side of his crossbow, it lay solidly on the wall in front of him. Bruce took a deep breath, and as he took aim, reaching the capacity of his lungs, he held the breath. Finally happy with his position, slowly breathed out and squeezed the trigger. The bolt struck the creature through the side of its skull, the bloody bolt exiting on the opposite side as the creature tumbled to the ground. "Another fine start to the morning." The sound of a galloping horse was getting ever louder from behind the multiple-tiered defenses. Bruce laid the crossbow down beside him and turned to look out across the quiet barricades. Just 2 other men on duty across the defenses, which they referred to simply as the walls. A horse and rider shot through the open gate to the opening between the outer and middle defense walls. It was Dylan. "Dylan, what's up, mate?" Dylan stopped and looked up the 20-foot tower, clearly relieved to find who he was looking for. "There's been a boat spotted up off the coast." "Any signs of life?" asked Bruce. "Nah, mate. It's just floating out there. What you think?" "Hang about. I'll be right down." He picked up the quiver of bolts and slung it around his waist, before throwing the crossbow over his shoulder with the leather sling. Picking up the glass of water he had been enjoying, he threw the last mouthful down his neck and climbed down the ladder to where his horse was tethered. "We going out to it?" asked Dylan. "We'll have to. Can't leave it floating out there not knowing. Last thing we need is something like that washing ashore. We got no idea what's on board." "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." "Why?" asked Bruce. "I kinda hoping we could let it pass." "Yeah, well, when we ever got what we wanted." "True," said Dylan. Bruce leapt onto his horse, and the two rode out across the island. It was a 15-minute ride to the shore where the boat had been seen. By the time Bruce arrived, 30 of the islanders had assembled at the beach, as much concerned as curious. They hadn't seen any more evidence of humans since Bruce's group had arrived 7 years before. The leader of the island, Bill Hackett, was awaiting their arrival. He was a police sergeant in their previous lives. The capable ex-officer was now in his early 60s and had been a natural leader for the group, who had left Bruce primarily in charge of defenses over the years. Riding up calmly to Hackett, who was intently watching the vessel through his binoculars, Bruce dismounted. But the old officer spoke before Bruce had a chance, or had even turned to see him. "Morning, Bruce." "G'day, mate." "I take it Dylan has brought you up to speed." "It's just what we see there. A bite with no sign of life?" asked Bruce. "Yes. You got any ideas?" "Just one. We don't know what's on board that boat, and it's entirely possible it could end up on our shoreline any time soon. So we need to check it out," said Bruce. "Is that you volunteering?" "Well, no other bugger will they?" asked Bruce. "Good. Then get a team together and head out. Just be careful." Bruce shook his head without saying anything, not at all surprised to get the shit job of the day. However, for all of Bruce's mumblings about his work, he was glad to have the role of security. It meant plenty of rest, no building, fishing, or farming, preparing meals of anything that he despised so much. "Dylan, grab Connor, Wilson, Bart, and Christian, and a boat." Bruce let the others go to work whilst he pulled out his binoculars and peered out at the target. It was a small sailing yacht, probably 2 or 4 berth. The sails were still up, but sagging. No one had touched the rigging any time soon, and the small amount of wind meant it was likely to go anywhere quickly. The yacht clearly kept a rib or small sailing boat on board, as the mounts and ropes were there for it, but the boat itself was missing, which was not a good sign. 15 minutes later, the 6 men were aboard a small wooden rowing boat, one of several that the islanders used for fishing. Dylan was on the rudder, whilst Bruce stood at the bow of the boat, keeping a keen eye on their target. As they slowly made their way, many of their community watched on in intrigue. The rowing boat clashed against the side of the sailing yacht, as Bruce quickly tied the bow rope onto one of the vessel's side rails, and Dylan did the same aft, lashing them to the side of the boat. Bruce hoisted himself aboard, followed by Dylan and Connor. The second his foot touched the deck, he drew a machete from his side, his 2 friends quickly following suit. The boat was eerily quiet, with no signs of life, and several ropes tossed loosely about. Bruce reached the aft of the yacht and looked down at the doors to the cabin. They were shut. "I don't like this at all," whispered Connor. "Tell me about it," said Bruce. Bruce knelt beside the doors and knocked them twice with the handle of his machete. "Anyone in there?" After a few seconds, there was no response. So Bruce again hammered on the door. "Hello? Anyone in there?" he shouted. As his last word sounded out, the doors burst open, throwing him backwards onto the deck, and a creature tumbled out in front of him. "Fuck! Kill it!" Dylan took a quick step forward and kicked the creature hard to the head while it was still down. The zombie tumbled over, but before he could follow up with his machete, a second zombie appeared through the doorway. He swung quickly with a strong horizontal cut that hacked the creature's head from its shoulders and embedded the blade in the rim of the doorway. The body slumped to the floor just as a third beast staggered through. With his weapon stuck, Dylan kicked the creature quickly in the stomach, sending it reeling backwards into the cabin. Bruce sat up just as the first creature was crawling on hands and knees to reach him. He swung his machete forwards and smashed it into the skull, sending the creature face first into a bloody mass on the deck. Connor ran forward, with his club hammer as the third and final creature staggered out from the cabin. With the hard vertical strikes, the heavy tool crashed down onto its skull, the neck compressing slightly from the heavy trauma. Not wanting to see if it was still alive, he pulled the hammer back and smashed it down onto the head again, fracturing the skull. The three men looked around, first for any other creatures and then at each other. It had been a long time since any of them had to face off in hand-to-hand combat against the horrors of the undead, and the pulse-pounding adrenaline felt new to them. Bruce looked back inland and could see Hackett watching intensely as the action unfolded, still not fully knowing the situation. Bruce simply lifted his arm with an upright thumb, and within seconds could hear cheering from the shoreline. He turned around to his friends on board. "Well, that was a piece of piss." The two men chuckled, still breathing heavily from the shock and adrenaline. "What do we do with this?" asked Connor. "Well, we can't just leave it as it is. Got any ideas?" asked Bruce. "Burn it," said Dylan. "All right. You know how to do that?" "No problem, mate." "All right. Get to it." Bruce climbed back down onto their rowing boat as Dylan made the preparations. Within minutes, they were again heading for the coast, with the sailing yacht left burning behind them. It was as much excitement as they had felt in years, and despite the risks, Bruce felt good to finally have something interesting to do, something to get the blood up. Chapter 12. New South Wales, Australia. The caravan of nomadic travelers crawled along the abandoned coastline like a rough old rope being pulled behind a child. The party of 19 people looked like something from an old war movie, each with cloth tied around their heads to keep the wind and dust out of their face. The group moved several miles from the sea, always on the hunt for anything of note that could be reclaimed from the wasteland and to help in their survival. Even after 10 years of travel, fighting, and desperate survival, they still retained a degree of coordination and discipline that even a military unit would be proud of. This tenacity and structure was undoubtedly one of the main reasons for their survival in this hellish scenario. A light wind threw up dust into a gently moving cloud of particles that seemed to be able to work their way through any thickness of clothing. As they continued their slow trudge, a groaning sound blasted through the quiet landscape. Those in the center of the column dropped to the ground first, and the ones at the front and back moved quickly to join their comrades in the middle. It looked almost like an old medieval army that had been threatened by cavalry. The sound became louder, and the urgency of the people became greater. In just seconds, the column of people had turned into a rough circle, a hedgehog of people and weapons. Captain Black, a Marine and leader of the expedition, carried a well-cared-for M4 carbine, along with a vicious-looking bayonet attached firmly to the front of the weapon. Next to him were his two most experienced Marines, Kowalski and Fernanda. They were veterans of many campaigns and over the last decade had fought together in scores of encounters with the dead. All three carried similar weapons, and the fixed bayonet seemed to be a standard feature of the equipment. The rest of the group was equipped with a variety of firearms, crossbows, and edged weapons. After so long in the wilderness, it was simple necessity that forced all of them to use, maintain, and practice with their weapons. Those that chose not to had gone long ago. Like the survivors of the first crusade, they were tired and hungry, but their spirits were high, and they were as tough as nails. Jackson and Decker, two survivors from the failed colony in Hawaii, stood with razor-sharp machetes at the ready. Decker carried a tired-looking revolver in his left hand, whilst Jackson carried a bizarre shield that looked like something from a Renaissance battlefield. It was a small metal shield, perhaps a foot across, yet fitted with the side was some cut-down sword blade. The whole device was strapped to his left arm, offering both protection and a weapon. Another man, slightly younger than the rest, pulled a cart containing spare batteries and the radio gear that allowed them to stay in touch with their base. "There!" shouted Jackson. The Marine pointed out to the swirling mist where a group of 7 creatures staggered out. They must have been turned long ago, as their flesh was badly damaged, and they hobbled unlike the smoother movements that they had come to expect of the recently zombified. "More of them coming from the ridge," added Fernanda. "Drop 'em," barked Black as he opened fire. A small volley of gunfire erupted from the group. Each firearm was used in semi-automatic mode to both conserve their limited ammunition and to ensure they hit their targets in the correct place. The first of the creatures were eliminated in a matter of seconds. As the smoke from the weapons drifted away, another small batch emerged. This time the dust and smoke obscured them until they were less than 20 feet away. Several shots brought down the closest, but 3 made it to the group. As the first reached out, Jackson slammed its custom shield into the chest and then deftly removed its head with the machete. 2 shots from Decker's revolver splattered the second's head across the ground. The third and final creature made it to within inches of Captain Black, who put 2 rounds into its head and another to its outstretched arm. The fight was over as quickly as it had started. As they checked their weapons and reloaded, Fernanda also checked the area through her binoculars. "I don't get it. We're nowhere near any settlements. Where do they come from?" she asked, though no answer was forthcoming. She continued panning along the horizon until she noticed a craggy shape in the distance, not far from the coastline. "Hold on. I think I've got something." Fernanda handed over the binoculars to Captain Black, who looked in the direction she was pointing. "Interesting. Looks like a compound of sorts, and right next to the water." Looking back, he checked to ensure there were no more undead surprises waiting for them. "Right. It looks clear for now. Let's head for the compound. Stay close and stay frosty. I don't want any screw-ups, got it?" he asked. A murmur went through the group as they shouldered their weapons and continued onwards to the distant compound. Captain Black and Fernanda moved up to the front, and a short distance ahead of the rest as they made slow progress. As they moved nearer, it became clear that the area had been abandoned for some time. The first part of the compound they reached was a low outer wall that was fitted with a series of long, broken-down security cameras. Captain Black examined the cables running from one of the cameras. It ran into a junction box, and then, a few meters further down, the cable was torn and broken. "Looks like this was a fortified refuge. Maybe a refugee camp." "Maybe. Look at this," said Fernanda. The Marine went further into the base, whilst the rest of them moved through the breaks in the old perimeter wall. She approached a covered mound about the size of a small house that was buried in the ground. It was sealed by a heavy metal door that was presumably locked from the inside. On the front was a heavily rusted wheel. Black arrived and moved forward, placing both hands on the wheel. Fernanda stepped back, aiming her carbine carefully at the direction of the door. With one mighty tug, Captain Black ripped open the door to reveal a dark room. As the door clanged open, he lifted up his own weapon and flicked on the attached torch, instantly bathing the room in a dull yellow. Black gave a short hand signal, and Jackson and Fernanda entered the room slowly. As they moved inside, the rest of the group arrived and spread out a short distance from the buried building to examine the site. "The good news is, this place looks like it was well sealed," said Fernanda, as she moved to a table at the end of the room. "Yeah, looks like this place has been stripped, though," said Jackson as he pointed out the bookshelves that were empty of items. "What the hell?" Jackson said, as he held up a medieval helm that had been resting on the table. Captain Black moved closer, examining the helm and several of the other artifacts that dotted the floor and table. He was intrigued by a piece of bent metal about the size of a jacket. As he looked closer, he noticed it was remarkably similar to his old body armor. "Weird. Is it me, or does that look like a steel breastplate?" he asked. "Yeah," answered Jackson as he lifted the armor. "Not as heavy as you'd think. You reckon they were using it for defense?" he asked. "If they built this place and survived for more than a few months, they must have armored up. I doubt even those undead bastards could bite through this stuff. You know what? I think I might keep this gear for myself," he said with a grin. Martin wandered in. He wore similar layered clothing as the rest, as well as a bolt-action rifle on his shoulder. "We found a few vehicle parts and trash. No fuel, food, or weapons, though. Looks like they left, probably a few years ago from what we can tell," he said, before heading back out. "Interesting," said Captain Black as he lifted a dusty leather tome from the table. He opened it to reveal page after page of handwritten text. He looked carefully at the first page before turning to Fernanda. "It's their log. Says here that this was their compound and refugee center." He thumbed through the pages, picking out any key points. "Looks like they were here for a few years. There's siege after siege, as well as an account of at least one big expedition inland to look for survivors." Continuing through the book, he stopped about halfway in, carefully reading the contents of the last page. "Holy shit!" he exclaimed. "Holy fucking mother of God!" "What?" asked Fernanda, unsure whether to be worried or excited. "Jackson!" he barked, ignoring Fernanda for a moment. The man came running into the room. "Get the radio gear set up. We need to contact HQ and fast," he said before turning back to Fernanda. "It says here that they were in touch with a major outpost, and they were planning on packing up and shipping their entire group over there. Even better, they have left the radio frequencies and coordinates for the site. According to this, they're soldiers, scientists, and supplies. This could be the place we heard rumors of for the past 2 years." He handed the book back to Fernanda, who soaked in the details as Jackson assembled the antenna for the radio. They were over 40 miles from their base, and their normal compact radios weren't powerful enough to reach that distance. "The gear's ready," said Jackson. Captain Black stepped outside and approached the radio gear, still stood in the modified cart. On the floor was the metal tripod that supported the antenna. Jackson handed him the microphone and then flicked on the power. It took just a few seconds. "Captain Black here. Please respond." "Base control here. What's your status?" came back the reply. "My status is I've just hit the motherland. Get Dr. Garcia and get her fast," he ordered. The radio went quiet for a moment, whilst presumably the radio operator went for the doctor. "Do you think they're still alive?" asked Fernanda. "Who knows? Maybe. They were certainly well prepared and weren't forced to leave. That suggests to me they certainly had a decent chance," replied Black. The radio crackled as the voice of their leader, Dr. Garcia, spoke. "Dr. Garcia here. What have you found?" Chapter 13. Mexico. The forlorn group of 5 riders had been traveling for hours, through what was left of the night and into the hot, glimmering morning. With only a few short breaks for water, they carried on through the day, knowing having anything to say after the tragic night before. Finally, the bedraggled survivors came to a halt on an open plain with beautiful views across the land towards the canyons ahead. After they had sat down and got a fire started, they relaxed just enough to finally talk, recovering a small degree from their frightful experience. "We're heading into the canyons tomorrow?" asked Madison. "I figure we will. Yeah. Be a change of scenery at least," Jack replied. "Is there anywhere left that we can go, Jack? Anywhere safer than we've been before?" asked Wells. "I'm all out of answers. We've traveled the lands for close to a decade now, and not one place has been better than any other." "Maybe we should have just gone to sea and found an island in the beginning," said Justin. "Come on, you remembered what happened in Hawaii, and that was after it was purged and recolonized. The reality is, there's no escape from this plague," Madison said, hopelessly. "So you think, as a species, we're destined to die?" asked Jack. Madison looked at Jack. "I'm not sure I believe in destiny. I think we've just met our match and are finished for good." "Perhaps God will save us," added Wells. "Yeah, we've seen a lot of evidence of that so far," Riley sneered at him. "Well, perhaps we aren't the ones who were chosen by God," said Wells. "You think there are other survivors in this world, still alive?" asked Riley. "Why not? We managed. Surely others did too." "Managed? Look at us! This isn't managing. This is dying slowly and miserably." "Well, you got any better ideas?" asked Jack. "Don't you think I've mentioned it if I did?" Riley sighed. "That's enough out of both of you. This is total shit, but nothing we can do about it. We're all still exhausted from last night. Let's chill out, get some proper sleep, and continue on with fresher heads tomorrow," said Madison. "Some good points," added Wells. The rest nodded in agreement, but nobody spoke. They just unraveled their beds and laid to rest, to get what uneasy sleep they could. Madison wondered about Jack's intention of going to the canyons.
It was rough terrain where their speed would be reduced, and they had a greater risk of becoming trapped. It felt as if Jack was intentionally leading them into a fight. Without admitting it, they all thought it, but nobody questioned the tactic. Living had long been a nightmare. Death didn't seem such a bad thought any longer. Madison awoke to the fresh, warm morning, surprisingly well rested. Perhaps the acceptance that they were all going to die sooner or later had helped, reducing the constant desperation and stress that they had all felt. No one spoke of their fallen friends or the night which caused their deaths. They were all happy to get on with the day, glad of each other's company. It was their most valuable asset left in the world. The 5 survivors packed their gear, mounted their horses with a new kind of enthusiasm and a relaxed vibe, eager to move on. After 3 hours of riding, they were only halfway to the canyons ahead, and the heat beat down on them ruthlessly. They were glad of the water stores they had amassed. "You know what I'd kill for right now?" asked Madison. "What, a beer?" "A snow cone," she answered. Not a bad idea. If it come with a nice cold beer," Jack said. "All sounds good, if I could enjoy them whilst traveling in an air-conditioned RV," added Riley. "Yeah, with a big TV," said Justin. Wells joined in. "Huh, that doesn't sound half bad." A few hours later, they reached the entrance to a large canyon with a wide path into the basin. They stopped as they entered the canyon, alerted by the sight of vehicles. In front of them was a line of vehicles, a few buses, RVs, and pickups. They looked completely deserted, with years of dust and dirt built up, and no signs of life or creatures in sight. "What do you suppose happened to the people?" asked Madison. "I'm guessing they ran out of gas," said Riley. "All at once?" she asked. "Well, if they were rationing out, they'd all be finished up about the same time. They probably either continued on foot or put what fuel they had left into the best vehicles," said Jack. "Where do you suppose they went?" "Probably the same place as us, Matty. Whatever took their fancy, wherever they hadn't been before," he said. "Hey, check out the Hummer! Always wanted one of those babies," shouted Riley. "You think we should check the vehicles for anything useful?" asked Justin. Wells moved closer. "No, just look at them. They were thoroughly stripped by whoever left them. There'll be nothing of use for us there. They're just old relics of the old world. Statues for future species to remember us by." "He's right. There's nothing left here for us," said Jack. "That's a crying shame, Jack. Always wanted to drive a Hummer," Riley said. "Come on, let's get going." They continued on, deep into the canyon. They eventually reached a narrow rock corridor with high sides with no end in sight. They stopped, looking to Jack for leadership. "What do you think?" asked Riley. "We didn't come all this way to turn back, did we?" "You know, we could become trapped if this corridor goes on for too long," he replied to Jack. "Maybe it's time we worried a little less and lived a little more," Madison added. "Walking into a potential death trap isn't my idea of living," said Riley. Jack's response to that was, "The whole world is a death trap, so how about we make the most of it?" "Fuck it. I just don't care enough to think about it anymore," Riley snapped. "Anyone else have a problem with the plan?" asked Jack. They shook their heads and continued on into the bottleneck of the valley. You know, this could lead anywhere, right? A dead end is just as likely as anything else. Madison asked Jack. Aren't our lives a dead end? I suppose. 20 minutes later, they reached an opening in the bottleneck, revealing thick scrub land. In the distance, they could see the track narrowing again into a thin alley. They trotted casually through the opening. The lack of wind and the striking sunlight was already making them all feel weary and sleepy. Madison stopped to take her jacket off, that was already open to allow air in, but was now stifling. They kept their base armor on in the days, a simple rule to keep them protected at all times. But the heat was simply too much, and nobody thought the worse of her for doing so. What the hell is that? Justin asked. Not sure, but I don't like it, said Jack. Must be a dead animal nearby, said Riley. That's what bothers me, was Jack's quick response. Madison caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, a bush rustling. She quickly turned to investigate, as a creature sat up, rising from the bushes. She quickly reached for her hammer, as she noticed a second movement near the first. They're everywhere! In the bushes! Jack looked around, as the dead rose from the shrubs around them, evidently having been lying lifelessly under the carpet of greenery, as if waiting for food to present itself, for them to pounce on. Get moving, now, shouted Jack. Madison kicked her heels in, launching forward as quickly as she could. Leading, she raced for the cavern before them at a full gallop. They were moving before most of the creatures were on their feet, but the few between them and the opening were standing and lusting for blood. She lifted the hammer above her head, swung it with a circular motion against the head of the first creature, taking it off its feet and flat onto its back. Her horse hit the next one, as if it was a rag doll, trampling it underfoot. They reached the narrow cove and kept up their speed, knowing they needed to gain some serious distance on the horde that was close on their heels. Less than a minute later, they reached a fork in the canyon. Madison quickly drew her horse to a halt as Jack stopped next to her. Which way do we go? Madison shouted. Your guess is as good as mine. Left! Called Riley. Why? No idea, just came mine first. You got a better idea? I'm all ears. She looked at Jack with fear and uncertainty. They could be gambling their lives on a toss of a coin. Worse still, both could be dead ends. Do it, shouted Jack. They continued on down the left fork, all praying that they had chosen wisely. A few minutes later, they met their greatest fear, a dead end with high walls. Madison pulled the reins around and immediately headed back the way they had come. Back to the fork, she called. At the greatest speed they could muster, they raced back, but were again halted when they met a horde of creatures as far as they could see down the narrow cavern, past the point of the fork. Fuck, shouted Jack. They again turned their horses and raced back to the dead end, desperately trying to buy them a few moments to at least think. They arrived back at the end of the cavern. What do we do? Cried Wells. Only two choices, fight or climb, said Jack. If we fight, we'll almost certainly die. If we climb, we may not make it, but we have no horses, and we lose most of our gear. Some chance of survival is better than none, said Madison. So, you want to live now? Asked her father. Yes, I want to live. All right, take only the essentials and get climbing, Jack ordered. Each grabbed what they could, which was little more than their personal weapons, including a few firearms they had left, and some water. Madison slung her prized AK-47 over her back. She had not fired it in 7 years, reserving the ammunition for last resort scenarios. The survivors could already hear the groans and unsettling sounds of the horde approaching. Madison took to the rock face, beginning the climb. The ascent was only 100 feet, but without climbing equipment, in a stressful situation, with gear on their backs and ever-impending risk of death, it was tough. Madison's hands were sweaty, from both the heat and the rush of the situation. Her grip was weak, but she struggled on. By the time they had made it just 20 feet from the bottom, the ground below them was flooded with creatures, howling and scratching at the walls in disappointment. "Listen up. Take it easy. We're safe from them now. The only concern is getting to the top safely. So don't take unnecessary risks. Go slow and safe," shouted Jack. 20 minutes later, they had only made another 30 feet. The heat was bearing down on them heavily, and their relentless enemy below would not be silent. They would not give them a single peaceful moment. "Oh, shit!" Justin cried out. Madison looked around to see him hanging by his hands at the corner of a rock. His legs were hanging freely, and he was desperately trying to find a grip. "Justin, hang on! I'm coming!" she called. "Maddie, no!" shouted Jack. "We have to help him." "You'll only risk yourself. Now be quiet." "Please, help!" shouted Justin. "Justin, just relax. You need to gain your footing," Jack called over to him. "How?" "There's a ledge to your right. Don't swing for it. Bend at the hips. Use your feet to find it." Justin desperately tried to find the ledge with his feet, unable to get a good look at what he was aiming for. The man was already panting heavily, in part from the exertion, and the rest from panic. "I can't find it," he cried. "It's just to your right. You have to reach it." "That's enough. I'm going to help him." Before anyone could respond to dissuade her from endangering more of their lives, Justin's grip finally failed, and he plummeted from the rock face. "Justin!" screamed Madison. The four left could only watch in horror as their friend landed on 2 creatures, crushing them to the ground. More zombies engulfed him. They could see nothing but an angry mob. "Fuck's sake, Jack! I could have helped him!" "No. You might have been able to help him. And you may just as likely ended up down there with him." "Enough! Let's get out of this unholy place," Wells said. Finally, something they all agreed with. Feeling utter anger and disappointment, Madison continued to climb, but faster, being the only way she could exert some of her feelings. It was another hour before they made it all to the top, and finally were able to lie down and rest. "My Lord, I wasn't made for that," said Wells. "But you're here, aren't you?" Jack asked him. "But Justin isn't." "No, Madison. And that's none of our faults. It's those bastards," Riley said. Riley opened up the canteen of water that hung around his body and poured it enthusiastically down his throat, without any regard for the little they had left. Hey, take it easy on the water," Jack said. "Why? We're fucked anyway. No horses, no food, not a lot of water, and just 4 people in a world of zombies. This is the end. We're on borrowed time." "Then why didn't you just give up and fall into the fuckers? Let them finish you off." "No idea. Maybe it would have been the right idea." That's enough. I'm sick of seeing and hearing these disgusting creatures. Let's get moving, Madison said. She's right. No point in dwelling on the past. Let's go forward, said her father. Like we did the other night, when we lost 17 people? What other choice do we have? Asked Jack. Come on, enough fighting. I've had enough of it. Let's move, Madison sighed. The 4 survivors staggered to their feet and began moving, not sure where they were going or even why, but probably because going forward seemed better than facing a grueling death. They walked for 5 hours, until finally Jack, who was leading them, stopped, turning to face the other 3. Maybe Riley is right. Running isn't getting us anywhere. It's prolonging our miserable lives. What other option do we have? Asked Wells. Well, our water's finished. We're tired, hungry. We can't last much longer. Would you rather die out here or fighting? Go out with a little glory? Asked Jack. What's glory if no one lives to tell the story? Madison asked him. God will see it, and know that we fought evil to the very end, Wells replied. Fuck God. I'm up for a fight to end all fights. What about you, Madison? Said Riley. I'm game. I'm sick of this life. Sick of those bloodthirsty bastards. I want to give 'em hell one more time. No running, no hiding. All agreed? Asked Jack. Aye, said Wells. Yes, said Madison. Fuck yeah, said Riley. Okay, said Jack. So how do we do this? Madison asked. Well, I'm guessing that the horde will be on us before the sun goes down. So let's sit, relax, conserve energy, and enjoy our last moments without fear, dread, or despair, said Jack. They sat down on the dusty, hard ground, counting their ammunition and preparing their weapons. Each of them had only a handful of bullets left for the firearms that they had so carefully preserved. They waited, all finally at peace with the world. For no matter what the next few hours brought, they would give it their best, knowing they had survived when millions had not. Across the open plain they had traveled across, they could see the hordes approaching them from a mile or 2 away. Enough time to watch them stagger towards them for maybe less than an hour. Remember, however this goes, we are God's children, made in His image, and we have stayed true. We will be the ones to see heaven, not those disgusting beasts, implored Wells. The creatures were now just 50 yards away. Okay, people. Let's give these bastards hell, shouted Jack. A hail of gunfire erupted, soon followed by the final battle of desperation. Chapter 14. English-Welsh Border, United Kingdom. Hey, buddy! Hey! You okay? Came a faint voice. Nick tried to open his eyes, but everything was still dark and he could hear noise as though there was a party or something going on. His leg hurt, but he couldn't work out why. He lifted his hand and rubbed his face, feeling something slick on his cheek. Nick, come on! Wake up, fool! Shouted a familiar voice. He struggled to open his eyes, just making out the shape of Max in front of him. He was being carried by several of the passengers, and off to his right he could see the old Land Rover, still on its side, and burning furiously. A pinprick of light flashed ahead, and one of the people carrying him fell, dropping the wounded Nick to the ground. The impact hurt, but if nothing else, it shocked him and helped him focus. As he looked more closely, he could make out several rustling, heavily armored cars nearby.
"What? Who are they?"
he asked, whilst Max dragged him to cover behind their own modified ambulance.
"No idea. Some stupid fucking raiders, I think. I thought they'd be wiped out years ago,"
Max answered. A short burst of fire clattered against the vehicle.
"Yeah, well, I think they're back,"
Nick grimaced. A loud noise indicated the arrival of the last two vehicles in the convoy, and as they arrived, the gunfire increased. The raiders were certainly badly organized, and had bitten off way more than they could chew. The armored minibus kept moving forward, offering protection from gunfire as it raced up to the raiders. Once it was close enough, the doors burst open and the passengers inside rushed out, all armed with various hand weapons from odd firearms. It was over in seconds, and with no more casualties. Nick lifted himself up, holding on to the side of the ambulance as he looked about. There were several bodies on the road. One of them was face down. The other was Zack. He must have been hit in the crossfire.
"Fucking hell," swore Nick. "We got this far, 10 bloody years, only to lose people to some pathetic local bandits."
He looked at the vehicles. The van was certainly leaking fuel, and the minibus was making a terrible grinding noise.
"They aren't going to last much longer. We need to keep moving. Come on," he said, as he hobbled inside the ambulance passenger seat.
The rest of the passengers climbed back into the surviving 3 vehicles, and in less than a minute, the much-depleted convoy was back on the road. Now down to just 3 battered and barely running trucks. The ambulance led, followed by the minibus and van. They followed the road for a good distance, until finally reaching the exit ramp that led to the port. Luckily for them, the bridge was still intact, though it wasn't easy to push past due to the large accumulation of rubbish and debris that the wind must have deposited. They finally descended on the other side of the road and down to the portway. As they rounded the corner, Nick spotted the rusting sign for the marina and docks.
"Holy crap! We made it!" he exclaimed, barely believing it himself.
The road ran alongside the waterway, though so far he could see no boats of any kind. The vehicles continued a few hundred yards further, until they approached a large, rectangular stretch of water, surrounded by high concrete sides all around. It was the city's main pleasure craft marina. Even better, it had over a score of vessels remaining.
"Mother of God," said Gary.
"I'm as surprised as you both," said Jessica, as she looked out at the sad-looking boats.
"There,"
shouted Nick, pointing to an open area that led to a jetty running out between the boats. They slowed down and stopped just short of the jetty. Nick swung open the door and staggered out, followed by the rest in the vehicle. As the first headed down the jetty, the other 2 vehicles arrived and formed up nearby. Gary scanned the area, checking for signs of the undead.
"Did you see how many there were when we passed over the bridge?" he asked.
Nick twisted his head.
"Well, I lost count. I think they've been lurking in the houses over there."
He pointed to the blocks of houses and apartments a few hundred yards back.
"You think they'll come here?" asked Jessica.
Nick raised his eyebrows in surprise.
"Are you kidding? Of course they will. We need 1 or more boats, and we need them in the next 10 minutes.
"Look," said Jessica, pointing off into the distance. Nick followed her arm until he spotted a small group of shadows waddling towards the marina. Jesus! They just won't stop, will they? Come on, let's go, he shouted as he headed off down the jetty. Along both sides of the rotting wooden structure was a selection of boats, with about 5 times the number half submerged or just below the waterline. Nick made for a rusting metal boat, slightly larger than a tug and orange with wear. It was the second largest vessel in the marina, and its rust made it look most worn of them all. "Are you sure?" shouted an unconvinced Max. "It looks watertight, and right now we need something that floats." As Nick climbed up the metal ramp that led to the deck, he looked around for signs of anything that might make the vessel unsuitable. A single gunshot echoed across the area as one of the people back at the vehicles took a shot at the approaching horde. Nick noticed one of the undead fall to the ground and allowed himself a brief smile. It was a good shot. 2 more people appeared from one of the official-looking buildings. He noticed Gary at the front waving a box. Max helped some of the survivors onto the main deck and shouted for the rest to follow. It didn't take long before most were on or around the boat, all apart from the 3 who were determined to take a small wooden launch out into the middle of the marina. As Gary ran down the jetty, he drew something from the box. "Keys! Good man!" called Nick. Gary ran up the ramp and headed to the locked doorway on the boat. The small wooden launch incredibly started, though with the amount of smoke pouring from the engine, it was hard to tell what was happening. As the smoke washed across the marina, it obliterated the view from Nick's vessel. He turned, coughing in the smoke. "We need weapons on the deck. Get ready for them," shouted Nick, half expecting the undead to appear through the smoke at any second. Gary managed to get the door open, and he entered the inside of the vessel, quickly followed by many of the others. The smoke started to clear, and it was obvious that the area would soon be swarming with creatures. Nick, Max, and a dozen others assembled on the port side of the vessels, each armed with the weapons and waiting for the inevitable attack. Gary appeared at the doorway. "They're working on the engine right now. It's pretty flooded below deck, but they think there's a good chance it'll get running." "Sounds good. In the meantime, we need to block the jetty or they'll be on us fast," he said. "What about the petrol in the trucks? We could burn the jetty. That way we can't reach us," said Jessica. "Yeah, good idea. It'll be quick, and right now we need quick," said Nick with a look of satisfaction. "Gary, make sure they get the engine running. Jessica, come with me." He jumped down and ran back up the jetty with Jessica close behind. He noticed the wooden launch was moving out into the water on his left, though there was still no sound from the larger iron vessel. He ran up the hill to the armored van and headed directly to the spare tank. It was held onto the back with a simple jerry-can mount. Pulling it from the bracket, he undid the lid and proceeded to pour it around the end of the jetty. "Don't we want the whole thing to burn?" asked Jessica. "Well, yes, but what if the engine don't start? We could end up burning the boat," replied Nick. "Yeah," said Jessica as she helped him spread the fuel. Nick glanced over his shoulder as they continued to work, spotting the growing horde making its way around the marina. "They aren't hanging about. Look, they already have the place surrounded," he said as he screwed the lid on. "No sense using more than needed. Petrol always comes in handy. Come on, back to the boat." The 2 took a few steps back before Jessica pulled out an old lighter and lit the fuel. The petrol caught quickly, and in seconds the end of the jetty was ablaze. They rushed down the rest of the jetty to the still stationary boat. Gary met them on the deck. "The good news is, the engine is nearly ready. They're just clearing the filter. The bad news is, it's going to take at least 5 more minutes." "Well, the jetty's clear. We should be okay for a while," said Nick.
Look!
shouted Jessica, pointing to the wooden launch. The engine had spluttered out, and the boat was drifting slowly in the middle of the marina. The terrifying thing, though, wasn't the drifting boat. It was the hundreds of arms and hands reaching out of the water. "Oh, great!" shouted Nick. "The marina is full of those bastards!" As they watched, the hands pulled chunks from the side of the launch, and the number of hands were forcing it to list heavily to the right. Nick pulled out his hand crossbow, but Gary put his hand on his shoulder. "Save it. Can't do anything for 'em. Right now, we need to get this old beast working." Nick watched, sighing as he saw the boat slipping slowly under the water, as the small number of defenders tried in vain to fight off the undead. As the little boat slipped under the surface, a great blast came from below their own vessel, and a plume of smoke erupted from its funnel. It clattered and banged before settling into a rough rhythm. "Good work! Get us out of here," said Nick as he turned back to the jetty. Already a number of zombies were walking through the flames, their bodies staggering and then collapsing as the fire burnt their flesh to cinder. The water near the stern of the vessel frothed as the rusted propeller started turning, throwing foam and water into the air. With the boat starting to move, Nick almost relaxed. They were several hundred yards from the rotten sluice gate that led to the open water. Whoever was steering the boat was hardly the greatest seaman, but with a little effort the vessel twisted and turned until it reached a reasonably straight course to the gate. They traveled a short distance before a terrible groan came from the rear, followed by a crunch and a loud bang. The boat immediately dropped in speed until it was barely moving. "What's wrong?" asked Nick. Gary leaned over the stern to check, noticing more hands and arms sticking out from the water before he spotted body parts on the surface. "It's them. They must have fouled the prop." The boat rocked, and then with a groan it tipped sharply to starboard before coming to a grinding halt. Nick lost his footing and slid across the deck before grabbing the railing. The rest of the passengers managed to hold on, other than one woman who tumbled off the deck and directly into the arms of the undead writhing in the water. With the boat now listing heavily, the water started to pour gently down into the hull, through the open doorways, as well as the cracks and rusted holes in the superstructure. Arms emerged from the water as the creatures pulled at the vessel, trying to board it. Nick kicked at the first one, and several of the passengers slid down the deck to help him. Gary emerged on deck after checking on those inside. "We got serious trouble. We're taking on water. The engine's flooded, and we got a major crack down the port side," he said. Nick swung his machete at the undead, trying to get aboard whilst shouting back to Gary. "How long?" he shouted. "Not long. Whatever you're thinking of doing, we need to do it fast." Nick looked about. They had about 24 people on board. The water was full of zombies, and the entire marina was surrounded. Wait, he could see one spot that was so far untainted. "Look!" he shouted, as he pointed to the left of the collapsed sluice gate. The sea defense wall was narrow and carried a slender bridge that ran along the top. It zigzagged until it reached a long abandoned control tower that was raised high, and presumably to the other side was the open ocean. "If we can reach that bridge, we can block access to it and regroup. It's pretty much an island. The bridge is the only way to reach it," said Nick. 3 more zombies pulled themselves onto the boat, and it took a mighty swing of the rotten oar to throw them back into the water. The boat shook as more of the creatures pulled themselves onto the bow, whilst the scores under the water pushed and tugged at the boat. With a sickening noise, the boat rocked over to its port side, and then with a lurch, it tipped over, capsizing into the marina. Nick was underwater, and could see nothing in the filthy, stagnant water of the silted-up marina. He did his best to hold his breath and kick away, feeling objects in the water, but not daring to spend any time thinking about them. He saw something lighter ahead, and swam with all his strength. With 3 great strokes, he burst out of the water about 30 yards from the far wall and the ruined sluice gates. He looked back to see the capsized vessel covered in zombies, and just 2 people, one of them Adam, hacking and stabbing as he tried to balance on the upturned hull. He considered turning back to help when he spotted the hand pushing out of the water, trying to find something to grab. He kicked hard and swam as hard as he could to the sluice gates. He could definitely feel all manner of objects in the water, but he wasn't stopping, no matter what they were. Incredibly, he made it to the entrance, and dragged himself out of the muddy water and onto the broken wooden gate. It was easy to climb the last part up onto the outer wall, and up to the narrow metal bridge. As he lifted himself up, he found a wounded Jessica pulling herself along the bridge. Nick moved closer and reached out to her. Sensing danger, Jessica ducked and struck out with her last remaining weapon, her machete. Luckily, Nick was able to avoid the strike, but not without falling against the railing.
"Hey, it's okay. It's me,"
shouted Nick. Jessica looked up. Her face was covered in dirt, and she had blood running down from a wound on her face. Nick moved to the railing, helping her up so they could both look back at the boat. The water was strangely calm, and it looked like they were the only survivors, other than the 2 left on the boat. As they watched, one was knocked into the water, leaving just Adam still swinging his machete at anything that approached. Nick put his arm around Jessica and rested her against him, helping her along the bridge until they reached the far end and the control tower. He lowered her gently to the ground and turned back, instantly spotting the first group of undead to climb the broken sluice gates. He pulled out his hand crossbow and aimed it carefully at the closest creature. He pulled the trigger and sent the steel-tipped bolt into the creature's forehead, dropping it to the ground. It was a good shot, and the thing was completely still. Their joy was short-lived, though, as yet more of them climbed up.
"There! Look!"
cried Jessica as she pointed to a set of levers and wheel. Nick moved over and unhooked the safety bracket, quickly exposing the levers. With a tug, he pulled on the first one, and with a clunk, the metal walkway shuddered. The other levers were seized up solid. "Fuck!" shouted Nick as he pulled as hard as he could. There were now over a dozen of the creatures on the walkway, and heading right for them.
"The wheel! Try the wheel!"
screamed Jessica as she waved frantically at the creatures. Grabbing the wheel, Nick pulled hard, and it moved just a few inches. He tried again, and kept pulling, the creaking sound indicating something was moving. He gave himself a brief pause just to check and see what, if any, progress he was making. He almost despaired, until he spotted a crack of light halfway down the walkway.
"Holy shit! Look, the gates are splitting!"
he cried as he moved back and kept turning the wheel frantically. The walkway didn't actually move itself. It was a much smaller secondary sluice gates made of steel that moved. The walkway was simply fitted on top, and was only wide enough for one person. As it kept moving, the gates opened, splitting the walkway like sideways drawbridge, and leaving the zombies trapped at the other end. 3 of them had managed to cross far enough that they were already past the gap, and were heading directly for Jessica. The first fell from a bolt fired by Jessica with her hand crossbow. Her aim was off, though, and it embedded itself into the creature's shoulder. As it staggered forward, Nick rushed ahead, and with a strong push, he shoved the closest one over the edge and into the shallow waters of the marina. The remaining two reached out, trying to grab at him. His machete was gone, so he was forced to punch and kick to keep them back. "Here!" cried Jessica as she slid her own rusty blade along the floor. Nick ducked down, avoiding a close bite as he grabbed the weapon and in 3 fast slashes decapitated the first and took the arms off of the second. With a final kick, he knocked the bodies down into the water. He turned back and headed for Jessica. Lifting her up, they staggered along the walkway as it wound around the base of the control tower. "You okay?" asked Nick. "Yeah, for now. What's the plan?" she asked. The two kept going as they headed for the door to the building. "Pretty simple, really. We'll hoe up in here in the tower and regroup. I'll get the light going if I can. We'll be safe for now." Nick tried the door and was happy to find it unlocked, though it was very stiff on the hinges. They entered the room to find it lightly furnished with a bunk bed to one side that looked long abandoned, and to the other was a desk with a desktop computer. The small round windows were all filthy, but very thick due to them being on the sea-facing side of the marina. An iron ladder led up into a hole in the ceiling, presumably to the light for the old beacon. Nick helped Jessica down to the bed whilst he slumped down to the floor. They were both physically and mentally exhausted. They both sat for more than 10 minutes, neither saying a word. The light was starting to fade now, and they had no obvious way to light the room. Nick pulled out his crossbow and loaded a bolt discreetly, then placed the weapon on the floor nearby. Jessica exhaled, sounding tired. "I know what you're doing," she said with a hint of sarcasm. "You know I need to be ready. Do you know how you were injured?" "In the water, that's all I know," she replied. Nick moved forward and examined the wound as best he could. It was a nasty slash, though she didn't seem to be losing too much blood. Taking one of the rags they all carried, he made a makeshift bandage and covered up the wound before stepping back and sitting down facing her. "The light's going now. What are you going to do?" she asked. "I have a plan. You just rest," replied Nick as he looked about. A series of noises came from outside in the water, followed by a dull blast from the direction of the boat. Though whether it was a fuel or explosive-based, he couldn't tell. He looked back at Jessica, noticing her breathing was slowing. Either she was dropping off to sleep, or she was fading. "Jessica! Jessica!" he said, though there was no response. He started to move forward, and then thought better of it. Stepping back, he picked up the hand crossbow and double-checked it was loaded and ready. He looked back to see her body still and relaxed. He couldn't tell if she was breathing or not, as the wind outside whistled on the masts and the buildings. He concentrated, trying to hear anything that might help him. Forgetting for a moment, he closed his eyes as he listened before noticing a quiet groan. He surprised himself as he stared directly ahead and into her bloodshot eyes. A trickle of dull blood dripping from her mouth. "Jessica?" he asked for the final time. She opened her mouth to speak, but more blood oozed out. Before Nick could say another word, she lifted herself up and rushed towards him. With the smallest of hesitations, he raised the weapon and pointed it directly at her approaching face. "Sorry," he shouted, and then pulled the trigger. The bolt struck her square in the temple, and with that shot, he was left alone. The last survivor of the Green Zone, and possibly the last living person in the entire British Isles. He slumped to the ground, staring at the body of the creature. Well, that's just bloody marvelous, isn't it? He said, almost laughing to himself, as he considered the situation he found himself in. He pulled himself up the thick wall and closed his eyes. Well, maybe tomorrow will be better, he muttered, as he drifted off into a deep sleep. Chapter 15. Resolution Island, New Zealand. The sun had gone down, and Bruce and Hackett were sitting in Jake's home. The old hand had invited them to dinner that evening, prepared by his granddaughter Amy, who had developed into as good a cook as she was a fighter. Jake was now in his late 70s, and not in the physical condition to keep up the hard labor. For this reason, he did what he could in other respects, one of those being keeping a listen out on the radio frequencies. They had established a strong and steady community on Resolution Island, but they maintained their original purpose of helping as many of the living as they could. Jake would check the radio frequencies on the hour of every hour that he was awake, and frequently asked others to do so for him in the hours when he was asleep. He sat at his desk in the corner of the room. Bruce and Hackett sat chatting while Amy cooked the stew for them. "That incident this morning is something we should give greater consideration," said Hackett. "How so?" asked Bruce. "Well, there's every chance that a boat like that could get washed up on our shore. It was more luck than anything else we noticed it and could sort it out." "I don't see how we could have guarded against such a thing, though. We have what, something like 15 kilometers of coastline?" "I didn't say it would be easy, but it's the survival of our entire community, maybe even what's left of the human race. We cannot risk a single creature reaching out the island. We must find a way to guard against what's happening," said Hackett. "All we can do is post regular guards and watchers up and down the coast, or build a perimeter around our homes and town wall," said Bruce. "We live a life without walls here. Let's try and keep it that way. It's what we have left of our humanity and sanity." "Hey, Chief, we're getting something," Jake shouted. Hackett looked at Bruce in astonishment. They had not heard anything on the radio in years. They jumped to their feet and rushed across the small room to where Jake sat. "What was it?" Hackett shouted. "Hang on, trying to figure it out." "This is Resolution Island. Please respond. Over." "This is base control for Pacific Flotilla. Over," said the operator. "Jesus Christ! Where the hell are they?" asked Bruce. "What is your position? Over," Jake asked excitedly. "New South Wales, Australia. We found notes of your destination at your last location here. How many are you? Over." "Just over 400 souls." "My God, we had no idea there were so many survivors. We're 232, mostly ex-forces." "What are your intentions?" Jake asked him. "I'll take this information to our leader, Dr. Garcia, and be in touch soon. Over," said the operator. "Damn good to hear from you, son. Over." "Likewise. We'll be in contact on the next hour. Over and out," said the operator. Jake put the handset down and looked at the other two men with a look of shock and excitement in his eyes. "This must be what's left of the Hawaii base. They would have had a fighting chance from the beginning," said Hackett. "All right, so what are we going to do about it?" Bruce asked. "We could do all the help we can get, both to sustain our community and defend it, and to keep the race alive." "True, and I can't believe that they're having a great time in Oz. When we left, it was a hellhole," said Bruce. Do we want that many strangers on our island? Asked Amy. We need as many people as we can get, and if we survive this long out there, they must be a capable bunch, said Jake. He's right, and the new blood is just what this island needs. It will boost morale, and having an extra hands on deck is definitely a good thing, Bruce added. All right, so we invite him to join us. All agreed? Asked Hackett. Fuck yeah, said Bruce. Definitely, said Jake. Amy, you happy? Asked Hackett. Yes, as long as they do their fair share of the work. An hour went by as the 4 islanders sat eating their meal, eagerly anticipating the next contact. The very idea of another large group of survivors in the world, and so close, was the most exciting news they had heard in years, and they could not resist discussing the exciting possibilities in a frenzy of conversation as they ate. Finally, it was 5 minutes to the hour, and Jake went back over to his radio set, the others pulling chairs up to sit around him. They waited now, silently, intently, desperately wanting to know more. Please come in, Resolution Island. This is Research Vessel Moreau. Over, said the operator. This is Resolution Island. Over. I'm Dr. Garcia, leader of the Pacific Flotilla. Who am I speaking to? Over. Jake handed the radio handset over to Hackett, pleased to have proven himself useful over the years of their survival, but now happy to let others take over. This is Bill Hackett. I run the island. Over. Well, Hackett, I will be honest with you. We've been here for what feels like an eternity. We fight a daily battle to survive, and we're all weary of it. We're looking for a better place. Over, she replied. I hear you. We have a solid community here. We lost the main island years ago, and are now settled on the Five Fingers Peninsula. We could always do with more hands. You'd be most welcome to settle over here. Over. Bill, I was worried you'd never offer. Over. We have a community that supports itself. Providing your people are willing to put in their fair share, we could make this good for all of us. Over. Understood. There's not a man or woman among us who's not desperate to get away from this place. We're preparing what vessels we can muster immediately, and will depart within hours. My navigator tells me it'll be about a 12-day voyage. Over. Roger. We'll eagerly await your arrival. Over. Thank you. This is exactly the sort of hope we needed. I look forward to meeting you in person, Bill. Over and out. Hackett put the handset down. He already had a grin on his face. All right. Looks like you weren't the only bastards to survive out there. Nah, but those aren't Aussies. Those lucky bastards were probably out on the water when all this shit started, said Bruce. What about our food supplies, Bill? Asked Jake. In what way? Well, our farms and livestock are only just providing what we need. Over 200 new mouths to feed could create some problems. True. But the sea has plenty more to offer, and with our very own army, we may well be able to look at reclaiming ground. Fucking aye, said Bruce. Still, we'll talk to everyone tomorrow about boosting output. I know it'll take time, but the quicker we get started, the better. What do you want me to do? Bruce asked. Do what you always do. We need to get everyone else to work. We need new homes built, more land cleared, more food planted. Lots to do, but we'll always need protection. Take 20 capable fighters that you can cycle in shifts at the wall. Everyone else will be getting to work here. And what about the risk from the sea we discussed earlier? Yes, to not do something about that now would be foolish. We're days away from creating the strongest community we've known since before the Zompok. We can't spare fighters or anyone from manual labor," said Hackett. "How about mothers? They can take shifts patrolling the coast while they take turns babysitting," Amy suggested. "That's not a bad idea," Bruce nodded. "Yeah, and it'll only till the fleet arrives anyway. Right, sounds like we have a strategy sorted. Bruce, attend the wall. I'll call a meeting in the morning," said Hackett. Bruce hit the sack and was asleep within minutes, tired from the day, but feeling utterly relaxed in the knowledge that life was going to get so much better. The sun was rising again as Bruce sat in his favorite spot on the wall looking out at the dangerous wilderness before him. "Whoa, few more than usual," shouted Christian. The guards were looking out at the creatures on the other side of the causeway, lined up at the opening, desperately wanting to reach their town of the living. Bruce didn't even reach for his crossbow, confident in the safety in which they sat. He simply looked out at his foe, studying their blood and rot-covered faces. "Makes you wonder if we've ever made a dent in their numbers, Bruce." "Who knows? There must be thousands out there, probably tens of thousands. I doubt we've killed more than 1,000 in all the years we've been here." "You want to take the first shot?" "Nah, mate. I'm heading to town. Hackett's calling a meeting. I'll be back to tell you the news when it's done," Bruce replied. "Okie doke, mate." Bruce climbed down his ladder as he heard the familiar sound of Christian barking the order to fire at will, the usual call that would take place whenever the creatures arrived at their door. As Bruce rode to the town, he could already hear the bell ringing, the signal for the community to assemble in their square for a non-emergency meeting. As he rode into town, the last of those not on duty were assembling, and there was a clatter of chatter. Hackett let out a burst of his police whistle to draw the crowd's attention. "Welcome, everyone, and good morning. We have some news to discuss, so I'll not beat about the bush. Last night, we were contacted by the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They're currently held up in Oz." A mix of cheering and voices immediately struck up, with people shouting more questions than could be heard or understood. Their leader was standing on a 4-foot stage they had built. "All right, settle down. Let me speak. There are 232 survivors among them, and I've given them an open invitation to the island, which they've already accepted. I know some of you may have reservations about bringing strangers into the community, but let us remember who and what we are. Human. They may be the only survivors left in this world, and together we'll be stronger than ever before. Their leader has assured me that they'll put their fair share into work here, and with their help, we can greatly increase the quality of our lives, maybe start reclaiming land." There were mumblings across the crowd as each and every one of them gave deep consideration to the surprising turn of events. "The fleet will be with us in about 12 days. What I'm asking of you is to put your backs into work until then. We need our farms expanding, land cleared, new homes built, all hands on deck. We can't do everything in less than 2 weeks, but let's make a damn good start and make our new friends welcome," he shouted. "Hackett, can I speak?" asked Bruce. "Yeah, sure." Bruce stepped up to the stage before the crowd, who were not entirely sure of what to think of the news, having gotten used to their routine and way of life. "Morning, all. I know the idea of accepting newcomers into our town may feel a little risky. Let's not forget who we used to be. Many years ago, you welcomed me and my people into your community, and we've done each other a lot of good since. Let your fear be of the undead, not the living. Our humanity It's something we have clung on to with every fiber of our bodies. The crowd's murmurs of concern died down. They were already being replaced by hopeful sounds and words. They were starting to understand and remember what hospitality they used to so gladly offer. Lastly, they may be American, but they're still human. The crowd burst out with laughter, calming their nerves immediately. Nice icebreaker, Hackett said to Bruce. All right, so you know the deal? Are you with us? Shouted Hackett. The crowd cheered in support. All right, let's get to it. They cheered in excitement. The realization that they had something new in their lives, new faces, new possibilities, new responsibilities, and enthusiasm spread through the survivors, driving them to work hard at expanding their town. The townsfolk toiled away for 9 days like this, whilst Bruce and his people guarded the wall with no real resistance, and the mothers of the town patrolled the coast, never an incident to record. Bruce's house, Resolution Island, 2 a.m. Bruce was suddenly woken by a loud crash as something slammed into his log cabin. He immediately sprung up and snatched his machete up from the table beside his bed. He could hear a howling gale outside and every rain beating down on the cabin. He walked to the door and pulled the latch across, but before he could push the door open, it was ripped open, slamming against the outer wall. Bruce looked out. Debris was smashing into buildings, much of it from the semi-completed homes they'd been working on the days before. Bruce had never seen a storm like this. It was ravaging their town. Parts of roofs had already been torn off and smashed. Christ! That's really gonna fuck things up. Hackett appeared from one of the buildings, fighting against the heavy wind and rain to try and make it to Bruce. Finally, he stumbled in, and they fought to pull the door closed. Shaking the water off, Hackett pulled the hood back on his coat. He already looked concerned. What a fucker, said Bruce. Yeah, it's a hell of a time for it. What do you mean? The fleet's only 2 days away. Who knows what a time of it they're having? Fuck me. Doesn't get any better. Any word from them? None. But I should imagine they're having a hard time of it, without worrying about us. I take it this isn't a social call, then? No. A storm like this could affect a lot of things, not only the damage we've already seen. Who knows what could get washed up on the shores? Or other unforeseen circumstances. All right. You want me to arrange some patrol duties? Yes, but only for the town. I don't want anyone traveling beyond the buildings until the storm's over. It's too risky. Get the regular patrols going. Hopefully by daylight we'll have this passed and we can assess the situation. But I don't want to take any chances. All righty. Okay, Bruce. I'll see you at daybreak. Hackett left the cabin, leaving the door open, and Bruce looking out at the relentless weather, the spray already hitting him as he stood barefoot in a t-shirt. What a fucking night, he said. Five hours later, Bruce sat on the stage in the square as Hackett wandered up to once more ring the town bell. All okay? Asked Hackett. Fucking marvelous. You're alive, aren't you? Just about, Bruce sighed. As Hackett was about to ring the bell, a horse and rider stormed into the town at full gallop. It was Dillon, clearly carrying vital news. Bruce! Bruce! Shouted Dillon. Hackett and Bruce's relaxed mood immediately hardened, noticing the sound of fear in the man's voice. What is it, mate? We got a problem at the wall. How much of a problem? Asked Hackett.
The causeway's closed up. The storm's choked it full of debris, earth and trees. It's all collapsed in. They're at the outer wall.
Jesus Christ, cried Hackett.
Sound the alarm,
Bruce screamed. Hackett ran up to the bell, but past it, on to the next instrument of the town communication, an old air raid siren, something they had not ever had to use, and was for absolute emergencies only. The old cop began winding the handle, and the tinkling sound of the siren rang out across the town.
How many are we talking about? And is the wall intact? Shouted Bruce. The wall's been taking a bit of a beating, but last I saw it was all right. But the fuckers were pouring in the dozens last I left. No idea how many now.
Within 2 minutes of the sirens going off, the townspeople were gathering, all fully aware of what that alarm meant. A life or death situation.
Please be calm and listen. We do not have time to waste, shouted Hackett.
Bruce ran and jumped up onto the stage, and Hackett gladly gave way to Bruce, who was the nearest thing they had to an army commander.
The causeway is closed. However, the wall is still up. We have all seen in the past that no barrier we can create can hold back the creatures forever, so we cannot afford to leave things as they are. We have to reclaim the causeway and dig out the river. And how do you suggest we do that? Shouted Keith. We need to assemble every capable fighter, now. We need to push back the creatures beyond the old trench, and then get others to clear it out, shouted Bruce. That's insane! It could take hours to clear that trench. We don't have a choice. If we don't get that trench working again, they'll get through our walls. Whether it takes them a day or a week, they always do, Bruce answered him. What about digging a new trench between the outer and middle wall? Keith, that'll take even longer. And could you likely compromise the structure of our walls? It's as much work as even more risk. Hackett intervened. That's enough. We don't have enough time to argue. Bruce is in charge. Trust him. And please do as he says. We need to work together right now if we want any chance of survival. Look, I've had all the time I need to give the options consideration, and now is not the time to talk, it's the time to act. The fleet will be on us in a couple of days, and that should provide us with some serious fighting potential, but right now, as always, we have to fend for ourselves. All capable fighters and builders, get your weapons, armor, and horses. We'll leave from the square in 5 minutes, Bruce ordered. Christian, get the shields for us. We'll be needing them, he added. The crowd quickly dispersed as they went about their duties. Bruce walked back into his cabin and flipped open the lid of a large wooden box in the corner of the room, revealing all the fighting equipment that he had so wished he never have to need again. He pulled out his quilted gambeson, mail shirt, padded leather leg armor, and steel gauntlets. Just minutes later, he was back in the square, wearing his old, worn armor, a reproduction medieval flanged mace dangling from his side, and machete in its sheath. Hackett and a few others were loading shields onto a small cart. Around 60 fighters had assembled in the town square, along with a number of men ready to get to work on the trench. Bruce climbed up onto the podium. All right. Here's the deal. We start on the outer barricade, wipe out everything we can as quickly as possible with the bows and crossbows. Then push beyond the trench, allowing the guys to get working on it. From what Dylan tells me, only 40-foot stretch of the trench has been filled in, so we'll be guarding that narrow stretch. I want 30 men with shields at all times out in front. The rest with range weapons, keep them at bay as long as possible. All understood? The crowd rang out in agreement as they strapped on final pieces of equipment and readied themselves. Right. Me, Dylan, we'll ride up ahead.
Remember, you're not fighting for yourselves. We're fighting for each other. If this goes badly, it could be the last fight we ever have. Always remember, whatever you're fighting for, and good luck to you all." Bruce leapt onto his horse and immediately kicked his heels in, launching forward at full gallop towards the wall with Dylan close behind. As they reached the edge of the town, Amy galloped towards them to join the fight. On the sight of the woman, who Bruce had known since she was a teenager, he stopped quickly and turned to her. "Don't give me crap, Bruce. I'm coming too." "I wasn't going to tell you to turn back. I just want to know you're ready." "I'm ready. I won't wait here whilst the town's in danger. I need to do this." "All right, let's go." They again launched forwards towards the wall. It was a short journey on horseback and at speed, but it felt like a long experience, not knowing what to expect, praying that the walls were still up and that the zombies were still in small numbers. Bruce arrived at the inner wall and could already hear the murmuring sounds of creatures and the odd twang of a bowstring releasing. They quickly rode to the outer gates, noticing they were already shaking under the pressure of the horde. "Jesus Christ! It's going to be a long day," said Bruce. The three fighters jumped off their horses and climbed up the ladder to the outer wall. Bruce looked down across the wall to see 5 guards taking shots at the creatures with crossbows. He looked down over the battlements to see over 100 creatures already clawing at the wooden walls. "We've got a good 10 minutes to 15 minutes till the rest of these lads arrive. Let's give these fuckers hell." He laid down the stirrup of his crossbow to the floor and pulled back the string, loading his first bolt. Lowering his aim down, he quickly acquired his first target and shot the bolt through its cranium. "Nice shot, boss," shouted Dylan. "Here, just another 100 of those and we'll be sorted." More zombies were appearing, through the tree line, the other side of the causeway, a seemingly never-ending stream, though fortunately in small and staggered numbers so far. The 8 fighters kept up their shooting into the horde below, amassing an ever-growing pile of stinking corpses. By the time 100 bloody bodies lay at the wall, the rest of the island's fighters were in sight. Bruce turned to see his reinforcements march through the gate of the middle wall. "Get your weapons ready. We open the gates in 2. I'm going over to that trench. Who's with me?" called Bruce. The men below cheered as they thrust their brutal weapons in the air, building the aggression and determination to drive the creatures back and destroy all before them. Bruce looked over to Dylan. "You stay here with the other 6. We need a presence on this wall at all times. Keep firing up until we open the gates, and keep a close eye on us while we're out there. We may need to fall back at any time." He climbed down the steps, ready to lead his army onto the causeway, into close combat. Christian was handing out large shields to half of the men, large rectangular wooden shields, the perfect barrier when used in formation. Every one of the fighters was armored up and ready for combat. "Christian, Connor, get ready on the gates," shouted Bruce. The shots continued to fly above them as the guards on the palisade kept up the fight. Bruce looked at Christian and Connor standing at the gates. "You ready?" "Sure, boss," answered Connor. Bruce turned around to behold the biggest force he had ever commanded in any combat, confident in their abilities, but rather less confident in their mission. "This is it. No fear. I want absolute brutality from all of you. We drive forwards until we get beyond that trench, and then we hold." Bruce looked around at his 2 loyal friends waiting beside the gate, waiting intently for his command. all of their pulses pounding with anticipation, excitement, and dread, all combined. "Now!" shouted Bruce. The two men lifted the large wooden plank which lay across the doors and threw it aside, pulling the two gates back. Bruce immediately ran straight through the opening and out towards the trench, trampling on the littering of dead bodies. Between the outer wall and the trench were 20 creatures, and more beyond it. Bruce did not even break stride. He simply ran past the first zombie and swung his mace into its head as he ran by. The force and speed of the impact sent the creature flying off its feet and into a bloody mess on the ground. The rest of the fighters were close on Bruce's heels, a well-armored mass rampaging across the causeway towards the trench. The scatterings of creatures proved no test to the well-armed and armored bunch. Bruce finally clambered over the rough natural bridge which had been created in their causeway and stopped 20 feet past it, slamming his shield onto the ground and taking a few deep breaths. "Come on then, you bastards!" he shouted. His companions rallied around him and formed a loose shield wall. Those not armed with shields fell in behind them, their bows and crossbows at the ready. The workers were already at the causeway with tools, frantically trying to break up the natural bridge that had formed. Bruce turned to survey the situation. Chapter 16. New South Wales, Australia. The massive fortified base that used to be an old harbor was the home of what remained of the Pacific Flotilla. At the start of the outbreak, it consisted of a great variety of vessels, carried supplies, soldiers, scientists, and refugees away from the slaughter to places of safety. In 10 years, their numbers had dwindled, as had their vessels and their capability to travel in large numbers throughout the Pacific. All was not lost, though, and they had set up a secure and reasonably safe outpost in this land for the 232 survivors that remained. The most prominent of this group was the scientist, Dr. Garcia, who was the elected leader of their number and also the person to have first come into contact with the infection and outbreak of the undead. On board the moored research vessel, the RV Moreau, the doctor and her science staff and military advisors studied the map laid out on the table in front of them. A small group of civilians in a mixture of work clothes stood to one side, whilst a man in a recently repaired suit watched quietly. "So, there you have it," said the doctor, as she straightened her back and looked at the people. Mr. Morton, the man in the suit, spoke before anybody else could make a comment. "This is an interesting development. The single most important contact we have had in over 4 years. What I find more interesting, though, is that they have a secure island location with access to the mainland and have been able to operate for quite some time. According to their information, they're already self-sufficient in terms of food, clothing, and basic power. Plus, and this is a big plus, the people have included medical staff, scientists, engineers, and other experts in many fields." Dr. Garcia put her jaw in her hand while she considered the facts before turning to Mr. Morton. "Yes, my thoughts exactly. The question is, what do we do, though? We haven't established a base of sorts here, but we do have our own problems. Dr. Willis, what's our status?" "Not as good as you might think. Our numbers are currently 232. Our provisions are adequate for another 3 to 4 weeks. We have started to prepare the land for crops, but it isn't going to help us for this season. We have no sources of fuel other than that on our ships. We have supplies from the last raids, but the real problem is We're not finding or creating materials in sufficiently high numbers to sustain the colony past the winter," he said. "Are there no other locations we can use for supplies?" "None," answered Ford, whilst looking carefully at the map. He wore military fatigues, and was the shady, though apparently recently reformed, thug who was often used on the dangerous raids to collect supplies. Though he had a good record for bringing back much-needed food and fuel, he always seemed to have more for himself and his small band of thugs than anyone else. "How can you be so sure?" asked Mr. Morton. "Simple. The last 2 raids found nothing," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "I don't understand," said Dr. Garcia. "You brought back supplies, though." "Yeah, I did," he replied, while staring directly at her. Dr. Garcia stepped up to the man, looking up at his hard face. "So where did they go?" she demanded. "For my personal stash," he replied with a smile. "You asshole!" shouted Mr. Morton as he moved towards the grinning Ford. Before he could get close enough, 2 thugs in rough clothing stepped in the way, each blocking his path. "My people are doing fine here. We are well supplied, and it's looking pretty good. Why do we even want to consider leaving?" Ford asked. "If you have supplies, then why aren't you sharing them with the group? We have an agreement in place to ensure all supplies are divided amongst those who need them," Dr. Garcia asked him. "We do, huh? You take the fleet if you want. Either way, the supplies stay with me," he said in a tone that hinted at violence. The room went silent as the group stood apart, considering their options. Ford, feeling he had the upper hand, made for the door. "I'll leave you ladies to make up your minds. Let me know when you want to work it out," he laughed as he left his followed by his 2 thugs. Mr. Morton turned to the group, his frown tight with anger. "This needs to stop. Ford and his lot have been a thorn in our sides for a long time. My recommendation is we need to make some long-term plans here. This place is barren. We have no supplies past a few months, and yet over the water we have news of this new haven. I say we go for it," he said. "What about Ford?" asked Dr. Willis. "I'll have a word with Captain Black when he gets back. I'm sure he and Ford could enjoy a little chat," Dr. Garcia said with a grin. "In the meantime, get the ships ready. We need to be ready to leave as soon as possible." It was dark by the time Captain Black and his people reached the perimeter of the compound and their base of operations. Dr. Garcia was standing at the entrance waiting for him. As the column snaked nearer, several people helped them inside with their carts, each laden down with various pieces of old equipment, armor, and accoutrements that they might find useful. The doctor noticed the gleaming of metal, and she picked out the metal helmets. She reached out and grabbed the nearest. The helmet was thinner than she had expected, but still heavy. "Interesting. You brought this back? Why?" she asked. "Simple. There wasn't much else, well, other than this," he said, as he handed her the log he had collected from the coastal compound. The column continued past them, each person trudging past and up the small hill to where the stores were kept. Dr. Garcia signaled to the captain to head towards a long-abandoned storehouse. It was a short distance from the main path. Captain Black sensed there was something wrong, but said nothing, just keeping alert in case of trouble. As they moved away, Fernanda noticed them. "Hey, you two need a hand with something?" she asked Riley. The captain gave her a simple hand signal, instantly telling her to be careful. She moved on, but kept a wary eye on the area where the two were talking.
Listen, we've got a problem. The consensus is to leave, but Ford's causing trouble again, and we need to get out of here without interruption, she said. I don't understand. How can Ford cause a problem? Simple. He's hoarding the stores and using them to blackmail us if we stay or leave, she added. So, why not just leave him? He asked. That would make sense, but he has the numbers and the connections to cause us real difficulties when we go, she said. Okay, why is it that I think you're asking for my help on this one? Look, we're nearly ready. We plan on leaving at first light, and we're taking everything with us. All I need is for you to make sure he doesn't cause us a problem, she explained. I don't quite get what you're asking for. How exactly do you want me to help? He asked. Ford is a jackal. We don't want him on this trip. I need you to make sure he doesn't follow us. Can you do that? She asked. Captain Black looked at her for a moment before giving a grin. Making sure that asshole doesn't follow us causes me no problems at all. How long till sunrise? He asked. Dr. Garcia checked her watch and then looked around him, making sure nobody was listening. About 3 hours until the first light. We need to leave by then, she said. Okay, make sure you're ready. I'll see you on the Moreau in 3 hours. Trigger the northern light in exactly 20 minutes. We'll get him then, he said. Dr. Garcia nodded, and then made to move away before turning back and placing her hand on the captain's right arm. Good luck, Captain, she whispered, before turning and heading back up the hill. As she walked away, the captain signaled to Fernanda, who appeared discreetly from the other side of the building. Get Kowalski here. We have a little job to do. As she disappeared, the captain looked around the perimeter of the site. A low fence ran along the outside. At every 100 yards stood a tall pole with an outward-facing lamp lighting up the immediate area. Behind the fence was another wooden barricade that was tall enough to cause difficulty in being breached by the undead. In the last few weeks, they had fought off small numbers of the undead, but nothing major, so far. As he considered his options, Fernanda and Kowalski trotted down the hill, both still in their combat gear and carrying their weapons. We need to neutralize Ford and his goons. You up for that? He asked. About damn time, said Kowalski. There was obviously no love lost between the two men. I assume he'll be at the old clubhouse, right? Asked Captain Black. Yeah, makes sense. That's where he usually is. Problem is the open ground from the center to the clubhouse. How are we going to get there without being noticed? Simple. We'll take the perimeter, work our way around to the back of the woodland. From there we have enough cover to reach the back wall. Cut the lights, rush the building, said the captain. What about those undead suckers? The last 3 attacks have been in that area, asked Kowalski. Fair point. Just keep your eyes open and your blade ready. The other 2 Marines nodded and followed the captain back outside the compound. As they left, they pushed the gate shut behind them. There were 2 guards on the entry point. We have 1 more load to bring back. We'll return in about an hour. Don't shoot us, he said with a disarming grin. The nearest guard laughed. Don't worry, we'll try and remember. The captain nodded, and then headed out into the blackness. As they moved away, he pulled down his starlight eyepiece that magnified available light and almost turned the blackness into daylight. Kowalski and Fernanda did the same. Once they were a short distance away, they veered off to the right
and made for the thick woodland. Captain Black wasn't joking, though. His cover had never been totally clear, and they had lost 2 people in the undergrowth to the attacks in the last month. Once they moved past the outer foliage, they were inside, and their speed was significantly reduced. The captain took point with the other 2 following slowly behind in a spaced-out column. Each of them held out a machete, ready to strike at anything that appeared. In less than a minute, they entered a clearing with enough space for 2 or 3 people to walk abreast. No sooner had they arrived when Fernanda heard a sound. She gave a hand signal, and the other 2 stopped, all of them looking for signs of danger. It happened with almost no sound, as 5 of the undead crawled from the darkness of the undergrowth and rushed them. Kowalski was knocked off his feet as the captain jumped in and hacked the first creatures to pieces with his blade. Fernanda pushed 2 more back, whilst repeatedly hacking at their arms and head. Kowalski, shaking his head, lifted himself up and joined in. Just a few more slashes, and the things were dead for the last time. "You both okay?" asked a panting captain. They nodded, and after a few seconds, straightening their equipment, they moved on and further into the woodland. They could just make out the light from the buildings and the perimeter fencing to their right as they circled around. After walking for 3 more minutes, they stopped and faced the compound. The whole of the tree line ahead was brightly lit by the erected flood lamps that provided security all along the barrier. Behind the barrier was a small workshop and the recreation area, known as the clubhouse, that had been taken over by Ford and his small band of thugs several months previously. Captain Black placed his machete back in its sheath, and from his side he pulled out a long truncheon. It looked like a shortened baseball bat. He turned back to Kowalski and Fernanda, who were both ready and repeatedly checking their watches. "Wait for it," he said. Nothing happened. The lights stayed on, and there appeared to be some kind of commotion inside the compound. "Fuck!" swore Fernanda to herself. The lights flickered, and then went off across the entire compound. "Go!" said the captain as he leapt forward, rushing the fence. In just a dozen steps they reached the barrier and quickly vaulted it. The higher barricade was just feet behind, and with a lift from Kowalski, the captain was up and over. He turned back, helping to pull the other 2 over the barricade and inside the northern section of the base. There was a lot of noise, yet the lights were still down. Moving carefully, they worked around the building. Fernanda entered the clubhouse first, quickly followed by Kowalski. It took just seconds, though, before she reappeared at the door. "Nobody here. Something's wrong." "No shit," replied Kowalski. "Wait, can you hear that?" asked Black. They stood silently for what seemed like an eternity. There was the noise of movement and smashing glass. Then it went relatively quiet, with just the sound of loud talking and the odd shout. There was another pause, and then the scream of a woman's voice. "Fuck! That sounds like the doctor! Come on!" barked Black as he rushed off into the compound. They covered the distance in less than half a minute, and without pausing, ran directly into the long-abandoned motor pool where Ford was standing, with his arm around Dr. Garcia's throat. Fernanda moved to grab her rifle, and one of Ford's thugs lowered a shotgun, pointing right at the Marine's chest. "Hey, easy now, Ford," said the captain, trying to calm the situation. "What's the problem?" "You know what the problem is," replied Ford, as he maneuvered the doctor between him and the captain. "This bitch is planning on leaving me here." "Yeah, I know your plan," he said with a snigger. Kowalski looked to the side and past the crazed Ford. "What the fuck?" he said. Ford, confused for just a moment, looked in the direction of Kowalski's gaze. It was all the time the captain needed, and in one smooth movement, he whipped out his Colt 1911 automatic from his right thigh holster. The first bullet struck Ford in the shoulder and knocked him backwards. As he flew backwards, Black fired 3 more shots, 2 striking the man with the shotgun in the chest, and the third just missed the second and final man. As the injured Ford hit the ground, Fernanda rushed forward and punched the last thug in the side of the face. The blow was heavy, and knocked the man to the floor, where she followed up with several kicks to the chest. Captain Black moved forward and held on to Dr. Garcia. "You okay, Doctor? Making me save your butt again, I see," he said with a grin. Fernanda had already clasped handcuffs onto the man she had struck, whilst Kowalski checked on Ford and the man that had been hit in the chest. With the sound of the commotion, a number of people from the camp arrived, some with weapons, though it was clear that the problem was over. "Ford is injured. The bastard will live, though. This guy, well, he has a hole in his chest. I think it's safe to call this one." The lights flickered, and then most of them flashed on, though a number remained down. Fernanda did a quick scan of the area. "Captain, we've got gaps in the line. I recommend we get on the ships, and fast." As if to signify the importance of their fragile situation, a volley of gunshots came from the west. Captain Black shouted at the top of his voice, "To the ships! Grab what you can! Move it!" The Marines made their way down the hill and towards the jetties where the boats and ships were moored. The largest were research ship and Harper's Ferry, amphibious transport vessel, though there were a dozen smaller vessels tied up in various states of readiness. As the people made their way to the craft, more gunshots blasted out. The evacuation siren sounded. It was incredibly loud and could be heard over all the base. It was not used for anything else, as the sound was likely to attract the undead. Given the circumstances, it was hardly an issue. Dr. Garcia was now recovering and trying to compose herself. "The craft are already loaded. We have all the equipment, supplies, and weapons on board," she said, whilst moving up across the access ramp to the deck of the research ship. More gunfire erupted across the camp, though most of the people were now already on the boats and small ships. Kowalski ran up towards the captain and Dr. Garcia. "We've got a problem with the Harper's Ferry," he said with a tone of urgency. Captain Black turned to the doctor. "Get the flotilla to sea and get started. We'll catch up," he said, and then started back down the ramp. A group of a dozen Marines dashed past, running along the water's edge towards the Marines' personal vessel, the amphibious transport. Though they were Marines, they looked nothing like they had 10 years before. Half of them were now recruits, whilst the others were seasoned veterans with long and tough careers behind them. As well as their worn-out combat fatigues, they carried additional armor, especially around their necks and joints. They looked more like a cross between a conventional infantryman and a medieval knight. At their sides, each also carried sidearms and close-quarter weapons such as machetes and maces. Times were obviously very different to their days fighting insurgents in Afghanistan. "What's the problem?" asked Captain Black, as he and Kowalski fell in behind the group of Marines. "There's debris blocking our exit. We have 3 guys down there now, but they say it's going to be another 10 minutes at least before we can move. Should we abandon the ship?" he asked. The camp was now almost completely empty, save for a handful of people carrying the last few supplies to 2 small ships. The smaller vessels were already pulling away, and the Moreau was belching smoke as she powered up her engines. With a final blast on her horn, she started to pull slowly away from the quay. The Marines were now just a short distance from Harper's Ferry. The ship looked like a smaller merchant vessel, but carried an interesting assortment of equipment on its deck, including 2 small hovercraft and a helicopter that was covered and lashed down. A dozen Marines were standing along the deck firing down into the waterfront as the first of the zombies tried to get close to the ship. A volley of fire from the group running along the water's edge cut them down, and in seconds they were across the ramp to the ship. Kowalski and Captain Black were last across, and as they hit the deck, the ramp behind them started to lift. Captain moved up to the firing line and lifted his M4 carbine from his shoulder. The second wave of the undead was much bigger, and 30 or 40 of them split off and made for the ramp. The Marines' fire cut down many, but their numbers continued to swell until 7 or 8 of them were grabbing and pulling at the ramp. "Get off the ramp!" shouted Kowalski, as he aimed carefully at the nearest. More gunfire crackled as one of the zombies after the other was flung backwards. Yet for each one that fell, another 2 appeared. "Where the hell are they all coming from?" asked Captain Black, as he added his own fire to the battle. With a sickening scream, the motorized winch burnt out under the strain of the pressure and smoke blasted from its rear. The ramp dropped 3 feet and hit the stone quayside. The zombies almost seemed to sense their opportunity and made for the access to the ship with renewed zeal. Fernanda and the other 2 Marines had worked their way to the bow of the ship, where she took control of the retrofitted weapons mount. It was fully manual, but these days, simplicity was king. The 2 Marines helped load the weapons while she spun the .20-50 caliber mount around. "Get back!" shouted the captain, as he quickly worked out her plan. The Marines moved back a few feet and took up position on the deck, where they could still pick off the odd creature. There were now a dozen of them on the ramp, and hundreds more were pushing their way to the entrance. The first 4 were already stepping onto the deck when the Marines' rifle fire cut them down. This was nothing next to the power of the bow's weapon mount. With the deck clear, Fernanda opened fire. The twin M2HB heavy machine gun fired a massive bullet that measures half an inch in diameter and was easily capable of shredding aircraft and lightly armored vehicles. Against the undead, this weapon was overkill, but the kind of overkill that the Marines could only applaud at. The first 50 rounds tore off arms and heads as the ramp was plastered in sparks and flashes. Only 1 creature made it across, and Kowalski took care of it with a careful shotgun blast to the chest. As more attempted to cross, Fernanda swung the weapon further to the left and started to cut apart the ramp with the weapon. The ramp structure shook and rattled as bullet after bullet took chunks out of the structure. The second swarm did even worse than the first, as not one made it across. With a loud grinding sound, the ramp buckled in the center, and then, with one final groan, the last half snapped and dropped into the water, taking 3 of the creatures with it. A great cheer rang out across the deck as the only access point to the ship was severed. Captain Black headed for the bridge, closely followed by Kowalski. As he made his way inside, a Marine approached him. "Sir, the route's clear. We're ready to go." "Take her out and join the flotilla," replied the captain as he looked towards the shoreline. The entire camp was now overrun as the undead hunted for any signs of life. "I hope we left nobody behind. If we did, there's zombie food now," he said grimly. With a mighty growl, the engines revved hard, and leaving a great plume of white foam, the vessel pulled slowly away from the quay and out to sea. As the bow pushed out, they could see the silhouette of the rest of the flotilla across the low light of the rising sun. The largest by far was the research ship, but there were a number of slightly smaller converted cargo vessels and a good number of boats they had recovered over the years. A blast echoed from the side of the camp, and the light exposed a great horde of dark shapes moving about. "Is it just me, or do we always seem to leave our places of refuge with fires to the rear and the open sea in front of us?" asked Kowalski wryly. "Of course, we're Marines. That's what we do," answered the captain with a smile. He turned back and watched the burning shoreline as they moved out to the deep sea. Chapter 17. Resolution Island, New Zealand. "Right,
You lot, get out in front. Shoot any bastard you can get a good shot at. Only fall back behind us if they get within 10 yards or run out of ammunition," Bruce ordered. 10 minutes passed quicker than any of them had realized, with very little progress made in clearing the trenches, and the creatures were already arriving in greater numbers. "Hey, boss, we'll be out of ammo in less than a minute," Christian called. "Christ, we were never ready for this. This isn't a skirmish, it's a battle." Bruce looked back at the trench and to the outer wall, and then to Keith, who was overseeing the clearance of the trench. "How long do you need?" "I'd say half an hour at least." "Fuck me, that's not going to be easy." He looked out at the skirmishers as they fired off their last bolts and arrows. "You, go dump the bows behind the wall. Reassemble here." As they ran back to the outer wall, Bruce looked at the ever-growing horde. They had never had to deal with the creatures in such numbers since establishing their causeway defenses. It was as if the hordes knew their defenses were down. "Right, boys. Look, it's our fight from now on. We need time, so stay sharp and keep formation." The zombies continued to stagger towards them in increasing numbers. The first few hit their shield wall and presented no real danger at all, but it was only 5 minutes longer until the sheer frequency of the beast was becoming a challenge. Bruce looked along the line to see his soldiers hacking away, breaking skulls as quickly as they could, but it was not enough. He knew they could not last where they were, and they could not risk losing their best fighters in the initial engagement. The causeway was lost. He looked back to Keith. "We can't hold out. Get going. We'll follow you." The men working over the trench picked up their tools and made a dash for the outer wall. "Right, lads. Time's up. Back to the wall," shouted Bruce. The islanders made their final strikes before turning tail and heading for the gates at a steady jog, easily outrunning their attackers. Bruce was the last to go, heading up the rear. Finally, he got through the gates as Christian and Connor swung them shut behind him. He keeled over, panting heavily from the exertion. "That could have gone better," he said. "Well, it could have gone worse, too," Connor replied. "Right, the lot of you stay here. We have no idea how long this wall will hold. Dylan is in charge. I'll be back when I can." He leapt up onto his horse and headed off for the town. When he was clear of the walls, he swore at himself, sick at the thought of failing, knowing full well how much trouble they were now in. He rode into town to find Hackett strapping on his armor and weapons. "How'd it go?" "We couldn't get the trench closed. We were overrun, and we're out of bolts and arrows already," replied Bruce. "Christ, that's not a good start. Tell me about it. Any news on the fleet?" "No, I haven't exactly given him any thought." "Well, maybe you should. They could well turn this fight if they get here soon enough." "All right, follow me." The two men stormed into Jake's cabin. "Jake, any word from the fleet?" asked Hackett. "Yeah, I got through to them. They had a rough time, but it seems they're all right. I tried to tell them what happened, but the signal was bad." "Can you reach him?" "Right now?" "Fucking right, mate," said Bruce. "Yeah, I'll try." "Do it," ordered Hackett. Jake picked up the radio handset, still a little alarmed by the men bursting into his home with such speed. "Pacific Flotilla, this is Resolution Island. Please come in. Over." They waited a few minutes. Nothing. "Repeat. Pacific Flotilla, this is Resolution Island. Please come in. Over." "This is the Pacific Fleet. Over," replied the operator. Hackett snatched the receiver from Jake's hand. "This is Bill Hackett. Get Dr. Garcia. Over." Is this an emergency? Over.
Bet your ass, son. Now get her on the line, he shouted.
The three men waiting impatiently for a few minutes until the radio again sounded, then heard an answer. This is Dr. Garcia. I understand you have a problem there. Over.
This is Bill Hackett. Yes, we have a situation. I'm going to hand you over to Bruce. He handles our security.
Bruce took up the radio handset from Hackett.
This is Bruce. Listen up, lady. There's a small causeway that joins us to the rest of the island. There are God knows how many thousands of zombies on that land, and the storm last night has closed up the trench we created to divide us. We have walls, but I can guarantee they'll fall before long. We probably have a day if we're very lucky. Over.
Can you not create a new trench? Over? Asked Garcia.
Not without a lot of time, which we don't have. Over.
We're estimated 2 days away. Can you bolster your defenses until then? Over?
We'll hold on as long as we can, but I'd bet good money that if you take that long, you won't find any living left here. Over.
There was silence for a few minutes. The islanders eagerly awaiting a response, desperately waiting for an answer to their problem. We'll do everything we can to get to you as fast as possible. That's the best I can do. Over.
Then that'll have to do. Don't hang about. Over and out, said Bruce.
They sat in silence.
Okay. What's the situation? Said Hackett. We know we're holding up at the outer wall, but we need ammunition. I'll take what we have in the stores, but that won't last much longer either. Best thing we can do is get everyone capable of holding a weapon to those walls and hold out as long as we can. All right. You get ammunition to the walls. I'll amass every weapon and fighter I can and meet you there. Right. I'll see you at the wall, Bruce agreed.
Bruce stormed towards his cabin and rushed in, again going straight to the large wooden chest, pulling out a wrapped-up sheet, the only thing he hadn't taken from the box earlier that day. He unwrapped the sheet to reveal his Colt 1911, the weapon he had become so attached to years before. He only had one magazine for the gun, and only 5 bullets left in the magazine.
Couldn't go down without you, baby.
He slipped the leather holster onto his belt, and was finally ready to continue with his mission. Moments later, he had Hackett's horse loaded up with all the arrows and bolts the town had left, and was again heading out to the front line. Bruce was galloping towards the wall. He was baking in his armor, sweat dripping from his hairline, the salt hurting his eyes. The only saving grace was that the fresh sweat had softened his gambeson, making movement so much easier and more comfortable. Chapter 18. Research Vessel Moreau. They had been at sea for 10 days when the storm hit. It started with reduced visibility, and then, almost without warning, the wind and rain hit hard. The seas were rough, and it became difficult to stay out on deck. For those on the Moreau and the Harper's Ferry, it was just uncomfortable. For the smaller vessels, it was a big problem. They were still several days out from the island. Dr. Garcia and Mr. Morton were in the operations room checking the level of the supplies.
We should be okay. Food and water are not an issue, assuming that what they say is true at the island, said Mr. Morton.
Well, we're well past the point of no return now. I'm more concerned with this storm. Any idea how long it will last? She asked.
We still have access to part of the satellite grid, and from what we can tell, we should be through it in a matter of 5 or 6 hours.
It's a major weather pattern, though. Look at this screen, he said, whilst pointing to the display. They looked intently as the cloud formations covered parts of the northern coasts of New Zealand, as well as large portions of the ocean. This must be hitting the island hard as well. I wonder how they're doing.
she said. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of one of the technicians, a woman called Martinez.
"Sorry to intrude. We have an urgent transmission from the island. They're in trouble," she said with a slight sound of panic in her voice.
"Well, there's your answer," said Mr. Morton.
"Come on, let's go,"
said Dr. Garcia as she headed for the door and down the corridor to the radio room. Mr. Morton was hot on her heels. As they entered the room, they found 4 more crew working on the equipment. The oldest in the room, a scruffy-looking technician called Darcy, spoke first.
"We're having trouble locking on their signal. The weather's hitting us hard," he said.
A voice crackled over the radio and Dr. Garcia grabbed the headset and listened carefully.
"The storm has breached our perimeter. We have debris that has blocked off our drawbridge, and they're trying to break in."
The message was followed by more crackling before it continued.
"Outer barricades. Trying to hold."
And then the signal stopped.
"This is the flotilla. We're en route and will be to you within 2 days. Do you receive? Over."
There was more crackling and just a few words could be made out, but they added nothing to what they already knew. Dr. Garcia lowered the headset and turned to the rest of the crew in the room.
"Did you get anything else out of them?" she asked.
"Only that they say they can hold for 24 hours, maybe 36. They said something about a causeway, but we didn't get the rest," said Darcy.
"Shit,"
swore Dr. Garcia.
"Look, they're holding for now. Get the captains on the radio in the operation room. We have some decisions to make,"
said Mr. Morton. Dr. Garcia nodded as she left the room. As she moved through the door, she turned back to Darcy.
"Let me know if you get back in contact. Also, if you do, tell them we're coming. Just tell them to hold on," she said.
Darcy nodded as they left. Suddenly, the radio crackled, and he called Dr. Garcia back.
"They want to speak to you, Doctor."
The operations room was bustling with a dozen people as well as the video conference facilities that they had been organizing years previously when the flotilla had spent all of its time at sea. Using this technology, the captains of the vessels could meet and discuss plans even when long distance apart. The storm was starting to recede, but it still rocked the vessel and forced anybody not standing securely to lose their footing. Mr. Morton moved to the center of the room, and Dr. Garcia stood nearby.
"As some of you have heard, the island is under threat. From the information we've received, checking our satellite surveillance, we think the causeway that joins the island to the rest of the peninsula has been breached by the debris or fallen trees. The island is well equipped and supplied, but they are under attack. The last report said the undead were across the causeway and at the outer barricades. From what we can tell, this causeway is large, but they have cut a wide trench to create a natural barrier that's defended by multiple layers of walls. The trench is blocked, and they're across and trying to break through the walls. If they don't receive help, the creatures on the rest of the island will keep pushing forward until they find a way in. They have 3 layers of walls, but they won't last forever. The last estimate was that they had 24 to 36 hours left before the defenses became untenable. It seems now that they have even less time. After that, the island will be breached, and it will be like Hawaii all over again," he said. Captain Jones, the leader of one of the smaller ships, spoke first. "I might be out of line here, but why are we risking all we have left to get to another island that's already being attacked? Haven't we been here before?" he asked. "A valid point," answered Dr. Garcia. "But the island's different to everywhere else we've been. It's large, self-sufficient, and has the people and equipment to completely restart a society. If we can help them, we can quickly clear the causeway, and with a bit of work, clear the island. It's close enough to New Zealand that we can use it as a floating base of operations, but not too close that the undead could wade across. In short, it's the best chance we've seen in years,"
she said. Captain Black called out from the computer monitor at the end of the room. "It looks like we have a running on time critical path here. If we arrive too late, we lose the island, this fleet, and probably our future. Do you agree?" he asked. A low murmur echoed around the room before he continued. "The flotilla is moving at the speed of the slowest vessel. This means we're maintaining about 9 or 10 knots. At this speed, we're not going to make it in time." "We can't increase the speed of our ships," said Captain Jones. The murmur in the room spread to argument as the scientists, crew, and a handful of Marines started to voice their personal plans and ideas. Dr. Garcia brought her hand down hard on the table, creating enough quiet to speak. "I believe the captain was speaking. Perhaps you would give him the courtesy," she said with a sense of irony in her voice. "Thank you," said Captain Black before continuing. "The Harper's Ferry is the most modern vessel in the fleet. We have the greatest speed as well as our hovercraft. If we push her to the limit, we can get 22 knots, maybe a little more if we push the diesel engines. We can also take the Jarvis. She's a smaller, but can match our speed, and will allow us to take more people. We're going to need every fighter we have for this." There was silence in the room before Mr. Morton interjected. "Thank you, Captain. That's a bold suggestion. Time, as we know, is of the essence. Does anybody have another suggestion?" he asked. Nobody spoke, and each person looked at the next as though the magic answer would just appear. Dr. Garcia moved closer to the display and Captain Black. "As you know, under normal circumstances, we would take a vote on such an important decision. Being as we have just one option, I give you my blessing. We pray you reach them in time, and will join you as quickly as we can. Good luck, Captain, and keep us updated as you progress. I'll get volunteers to your vessel in the next 15 minutes. Captain Black nodded. "We'll see you all on the island. Good luck to us all." The screen flickered, and then went blank. Chapter 19. Resolution Island, New Zealand. Rushing through the inner and middle gates, Bruce rode through the troops amassed at the gate and walls, ready to fight. He looked up at Dillon on the wall. "Get this ammunition shared out immediately. Just bear in mind it's all we have left." He untied several quivers from the horse and carried them up to the walls as others helped, finally stopping to look out across the plain. A horrible shiver ran down Bruce's spine, the sight of a countless horde before them, almost as far back as the trench and getting increasingly bigger. "Fuck me, what a nightmare." "Be thankful you're on this side of the barrier, mate," said Dillon. "Get shooting as quickly as you can. Make sure the shots count, but no point in saving them. We need to cull these bastards as best we can." They handed out the ammunition along the wall, but it was spread pretty thin. Within minutes, bolts and arrows were pouring into the crowd below. "Any word on the fleet?" asked Dillon. "They're getting a shift on. Best they can do." "Fucking Yanks. Never on time for anything." "Better they exist than they're coming on not, or we be completely fucked." "Do you think they can make any difference?" "They're our last hope," said Bruce. "Do we have a plan?" "Hold the wall as long as we can. If it gets breached, move back to the middle of the wall, and hope we can hold for that." "Sounds like a great plan." "If you got something better, let me know," shouted Bruce. The two men picked up their crossbows and joined the fight. After an hour's shooting, all the ammunition they had was gone. There were hundreds of creatures dead outside their walls, and yet it didn't seem to have made much difference. Hackett arrived with another 90 people, mostly a mix of teenagers and women, but all equipped as best as they could to fight. Bruce climbed down to meet their leader, disappointed not to be giving better news.
Hackett, our ammo's almost out, and we've barely made a dent in their numbers. Now, we have no weapons to fight them from the walls.
Stones?
Said Hackett.
What?
Hackett turned to the crowd he had led.
Listen up. The arrows and bolts are all gone, but it's vital that we keep fighting at the walls. We need to collect rocks, as hefty as you can find and carry, and mass them between the inner and middle walls. Go.
The sound of the wooden gates shaking under the pressure and hammering of the creatures was ever resounding in the background. The two men turned to look at it, surrounded by Bruce's men, ready to fight. Looking down the length of the wall, they could see the parts of the palisade swaying under the pressure of the horde.
"Shall we fall back to the middle wall?" asked Hackett. "If this wall falls so quickly, we'll never defend the other two for long enough," said Bruce. "You want to fight 'em in the breach?" "I don't see we have a choice. Get all your people to the middle wall, and keep building up any stocks of weapons, rocks, anything at those walls."
Hackett rushed off to attend to the middle layer of defenses. The outer wall was by far the shortest defensive line, another reason that Bruce was so keen to defend it. The middle wall was 1/2 kilometer in width, and the inner defense stretched far more. Bruce climbed back up the ladder to the tower, where Dillon watched the horde completely out of ammunition.
"Hey, mate, get half the guys along the battlements to set up the middle wall. Hackett's piling up rocks for them to use once this wall goes."
"What are we going to do with rocks?"
"Throw them, you fucking idiot. Get the other half of your guys to join us at the bottom to fight at any breach."
He grabbed the chair that had spent so many sunrises sitting in and pulled it up to the front of the watchtower and sat down, relaxing slightly. There was nothing left to do now but wait. Wait until a breach was created, and hope that the time would not come too soon. Hours passed with the horde at the walls, and the islanders sat around, never fully relaxing. At 3 p.m., women from the town carried water and food down to the fighters, who gladly accepted them. It was an uncomfortable meal, never being able to drown out the drone of the horde. Hours more passed until the sun was finally going down.
"Connor, hit the lights,"
shouted Bruce.
"You sure?"
"Yeah. Can't do us any harm now. And I'd like to at least see what I'm fighting." Connor jogged back through the gates of the middle wall, and a few seconds later the lights along the 3 barricades spluttered and came to life. The defensive lines were lit up like a glowing beacon. Bruce could see many of the lights swaying back and forth as the palisade wall shook and swayed under the immense pressure of the horde.
"Connor, spread the guys out. I want full coverage inside the wall. We have no idea where the breach will come."
Before Connor could react, part of the wall in front of him buckled and a large piece of the palisade collapsed onto him. He was wearing a metal kettle helm from his reenactment days, but the trauma knocked him to the ground, unconscious.
"Get to the breach!"
Bruce called. The creatures took full advantage of the small hole in the wall and began pushing and pulling on the next wooden poles of the wall. Bruce jumped onto the ladder. Wilson ran to the breach with his hammer as the first creature pushed its head through the increasing gap. As it opened its jaw in anticipation, Wilson smashed the hammer onto its skull and struck a second time to be sure. Bruce reached the ground and rushed to Wilson's side, joined by Gordon and Bart.
"Give 'em hell,"
shouted Bruce. The breach was quickly pulled apart, wide enough for 3 creatures to get through at a time. but it was fortunately a small enough bottleneck for the islanders to keep the fight contained. The 5 men at the front fought in a semicircular fashion. Christian hauled Connor onto his shoulder and carried him through the middle gate, placing him against the inner wall. The fight went on for 30 minutes. When 5 men at the front were utterly fatigued, their arms barely able to lift their weapons any longer.
"Christian, grab some guys and get ready to take over."
5 men fresh from a rest, led by Christian, rushed forward, replacing their weary comrades. Bruce shambled over to Brooke, who was waiting with the other fighters behind the breach. He was utterly exhausted, breathing heavily, sweat dripping from the sleeve of his gambeson and streamed down his face.
"Brooke, we need to rest up. We'll head for the middle wall. You tell each group to head back to me as they grow tired. Once the last group is done, tell them to get their asses back through the gate quickly." "All right, boss. We'll keep up the fight."
Bruce nodded, barely able to speak anymore. He staggered back with his fatigued friends through the gate, where Amy and Dylan were waiting.
"What a fucking party,"
said Bruce. He slung his mace onto his belt and climbed the ladder to the tower where Hackett was stood, watching the fight unfold before his eyes.
"How we doing, Bruce?" "I reckon we can hold that wall for a couple of hours, maybe longer." "That's far from ideal." "Tell me about it," Bruce answered. "You look exhausted." "This isn't Lord of the Rings. People get tired." "I hadn't realized it would happen quite so quickly, though," said Hackett thoughtfully. "You got the rocks ready?" Hackett walked over to the south side of the tower and pointed out across the wall. The battlements were stacked with rocks. "I still have people out there finding what they can. It's the best we can do." Bruce slumped into a chair in the tower of the middle of the wall and watched the fighting at the breach, a complete stalemate. The fight went on for 90 minutes, until only one team was left at the outer wall, led by Keith. They'd been fighting for just a few minutes when Bruce was drawn to a large creaking sound of the gate, and it finally burst open, one of the doors flying off its hinges. "Keith, get your men back!"
Bruce shouted. Keith looked around at the creatures already pouring through the gates.
"Christ, run!"
The 5 men turned, but as they began to move, Keith was grabbed by his left arm and pulled into the horde as they poured through the breach. None of the other fighters had seen him disappear into the foul mass of creatures, each desperately running to the middle gate. The terror and fear of potentially being locked out and at the mercy of the filthy beasts was enough to keep their pace up. The 4 men charged through the gate and watched in relief as Dylan and Amy swung the gates close.
"Dylan!"
shouted Bruce.
"Yes, boss?" "We need to bolster those gates. We cannot have them falling as quickly as the first. Get some tree trunks and bolster them through the gates and ground. That should help a lot." "I'm on it."
It was a matter of minutes before the horde began hammering at the middle wall. Bruce climbed down onto the main battlement and picked up the biggest rock he could and leaned over the ledge, throwing it with force. The large, jagged rock crushed the head of a creature, smashing it into a bloody pulp on the ground.
"Have that, you bastard!"
The other fighters along the wall followed suit, smashing the creatures below with rocks. Another 30 minutes went by, and the last of their ammunition was gone. Bruce climbed back up to the tower where Hackett was watching the progress of the battle.
"What now?"
asked Hackett.
"We'll bolster that gate, but there's nothing much left to do but wait. Fight if they breach, fall back to the last wall if we can't hold, and fucking hope the Yanks arrive in time to do some of the work."
Bruce walked to the edge of the tower and looked out across the survivors who stood watching the horde with nothing to do but wait.
Listen up, all of you."
The islanders turned to listen, only just able to hear him over the sound of groaning and the bloodthirsty horde below.
"I know you're all tired, but the chances are that help will be with us soon, maybe by the morning. We just have to hold. I think we're safe here for at least a few hours, so I want you to get some rest. Take it in shifts, get any sleep you can, even if it's just an hour." "You think the walls will hold until then?" asked Hackett. "Maybe. The horde can't get quite as much pressure on here. They have the remnants of the outer wall blocking them, and they're spread over a wider surface area. We have a reasonable chance." "Then get some sleep. I'll take watch here." "It's much appreciated, mate."
He slumped in his chair, his clothes soaked through with sweat. Within minutes, Bruce was asleep. Not because he was at peace or comfortable, but because he was thoroughly exhausted. His worries and stress were not enough to keep his eyes open. 6 hours later, he was abruptly woken up by shouting. He leapt to his feet and looked down to the gate where he could see Dylan hacking away at a creature. Other people were joining him in the fight. Looking out across the main landmass of Resolution Island to the east, some light was already shimmering off the forest. It was almost daylight. Hackett appeared at the top of the ladder and jumped into the watchtower.
"The gate is breached, but it's holding for now. It's a major bottleneck. The Yanks will be here soon. We just need more time."
Bruce moved to the southern side of the tower.
"Amy, get your people on the ground. Spread out across the inner wall. They could breach at any point. We must hold."
He turned to the northern side, seeing Christian stood watching the fight at the breach.
"Christian, spread out along the ground."
"What do you want me to do?" asked Hackett.
"Grab a weapon and be ready to go where I go."
As the words left his mouth, he saw a section of the northern wall, a long way from him, smash down, and several creatures tumble through the breach.
To the north! To the north! Feel the breach!"
Bruce slid down the ladder and ran towards the north, where Wilson and Bart were taking the first strikes at their new foes. 30 fighters converged on the opening and smashed the zombies before them, slowly hacking their way back to the opening. Bruce reached the fight and immediately threw himself into it, smashing a creature with his mace. The other fighters were boxing in the creatures with their shields, driving them back to the wall and stamping over the bodies of their victims.
"Bruce, we must retreat," called Hackett. "No, we must hold as long as possible."
In their push to drive the creatures back, 2 of the foul monsters grabbed hold of Gordon and pulled him through the breach with them as they were forced back. Blood spewed from his neck as within seconds they bit into him.
"Bruce, we can't hold," shouted Hackett.
Before Bruce could respond, a loud, booming sound rang out over the valley, the sound of a ship's foghorn. The survivors and creatures stopped for just a second, all just as curious to see the source of the sound as each other.
"It's the fleet!"
"Fight on!
Give them all you got!"
shouted Bruce. Chapter 20. USS Harper's Ferry. The sky was clear, and the island was starting to take form in the distance. On the deck of the military vessel, the Marines were lined up and checking their gear. Running to the side of the small ship was the old Coast Guard vessel Jarvis, the Hamilton-class high-endurance cutter. Of the Marines that had originally joined the flotilla, many had been killed or injured over the years. Luckily, their number had been bolstered by new recruits. Even so, the total number of combat-effective Marines was now just 42, though they all had additional jobs when not on combat operations. A small colony could not afford to all be warriors. As well as the Marines, another 24 volunteers from the other vessel had come aboard to help with the relief of the island. This extra crew was armed with a variety of mixed armor and weapons. Each of the Marines wore the now distinctive custom combination of combat fatigues and modified armor. Captain Black wore his well-used combat gear, as well as a few extra modified pieces from the metal armor he'd salvaged at the abandoned camp just over a week before. He especially liked the small breastplate that he wore in place of his old ballistic body armor. It may not offer any more protection than he already had, but he liked the idea of making use of something from the old world that was still effective. The 2 hovercraft were ready, and their engines were growling away as they were prepped for action. They looked more like small ferry boats than hovercraft, and were used to transport men, vehicles, and equipment directly into action. Captain Black turned back to the men and women on the deck. "The latest radio report says they have a breach to the right, and the barricades are being torn down near the causeway. I'd say they have an hour, tops. After that, we may as well not bother," he said.
"Shit! Can we go any faster?"
shouted Carlo over the din of the hovercraft. "No, they can, though," said Captain, as he pointed to the hovercraft. Captain Black gave a cutting hand signal, and the engineers cut the engines of the craft, instantly lowering the sound on the deck. The island was getting closer. "This is the plan. Carlo and Reiner will lead the first hovercraft to the breach and to the right. I want your squad to hit the gap first. You'll need the assault gear for this one, as you'll be driving right into the breach from the outside, the same side as the undead. You can expect close-quarter fighting. Take most of the Marines with you, but you must hit hard and hit fast. Get on the breach, through the gaps, and clear the perimeter. Then sweep towards the causeway. You can reinforce any gaps with your reserves on the second hovercraft. Just make sure your assault team pushes onto the causeway and meets us. The second hovercraft will move in behind the wall and help push back any that have made it through the breach. I'll take Jarvis, as she can hit almost 30 knots, right down the waterway connecting the island to the peninsula. We'll hit the causeway, sever the connection, and halt the undead reinforcement. We'll then meet at the breach and ensure it's properly sealed. Between the Jarvis, the deck weapons, and your assault squad, we should be able to solve this little problem. Understood?" The Marines let out a gutsy, "Hoorah!" before turning to their allotted vessel. Captain Black made for the small motorboat waiting to take him to the cutter. Fernanda and Kowalski flanked him as he climbed down the rope ladder to the boat. As it moved off, Fernanda leaned over to the captain. "You think we'll fit down the channel?" she asked. "Yeah, according to our charts, we'll be okay. But it might be a bit tight," he said. "Oh, great," groaned Kowalski. The first hovercraft was already moving away from Harper's Ferry with the second close behind it. On the deck were 24 Marines, all heavily equipped and ready for action. At the front was a small 6-man unit, comprising the Afghan veterans Carlo, Reiner, Talia, Ken, Ian, and Vea. This unit was the most heavily armored of all, each carrying additional plating and armor on their limbs, and shorter-ranged weapons. They looked like some bizarre mix of combat veterans crossed with a medieval soldier. Behind this group there were the more conventionally armed Marines, though all wore armor to one extent or another. The shoreline was now only a few minutes away, and as they moved closer the importance of the island became clear to them all. Along the causeway side of the island was what was left of a multi-layered single barrier that was marked with a number of watchtowers that could maintain vigil over the perimeter. Behind the barrier, the roofs of various structures and chimneys could just be made out through the island, though the island was substantial. From the satellite maps they had seen, the dozens of crop fields and buildings that had been built and erected for the community. Of more importance, though, was that there were signs of movement along the edge of the island. Carlo lifted his binoculars to the right hand of the island, looking for the breach that Captain had described. The left-hand side was a narrow channel that separated the island from the mainland mass of larger undead occupied island. There was a slight break in the outline that drew his attention, a dozen or so meters to the side where he was looking. Then he spotted the breach.
"Man, they got trouble,"
he said as he passed the binoculars to Talia. She looked carefully while Carlo shouted to those behind him.
"This last wall is about 400 or 500 meters long. In the middle, where the main gate is, you can see a major fight going on. Further along the wall, near the water's edge, is a second breach. It's about 400 meters wide, and it looks like they've broken in through the outer perimeter. Yeah, I can see the damage and gaps along the center length of that section. They must have fallen back to a secondary defensive line. We're going in, and we're going hard and fast. Take us right up the breach and to the gap. We can't wait any longer. We'll hit the breach from both sides and then move along the wall to help with the main fight," he said. "Yeah, I can see 'em fighting inside. From what I can see, the main action is as we thought. At the damaged causeway and the breach further along in the secondary defenses, looks like they're using hand weapons. Not much, if any, way of firearms," she said.
"Just as well we're here, then," said Reiner, as he lifted up an improvised metal warhammer. He carried a police riot shield on his left arm. Carlo looked to the left as he spotted the foam spraying up from the Coast Guard cutter. It looked like a small, sleek military vessel, and though rough-looking, it was well-maintained and moving at a good rate of speed. He could just make out the shapes of Captain Black and Kowalski, who were preparing the weapons on the bow of the vessel. A tap on his shoulder from Reiner let him know they were only a few seconds from the shore. He turned around and signaled to the rest of the team. They returned the hand signal. They were ready to go. He looked forward. The shore came racing towards them, and the craft moved smoothly up the beach and towards the barricade. Carlo stopped counting at 24 zombies before they slowed down, and without pausing, he leapt off the front, closely followed by other 5 assault marines. Behind them followed the rest with their weapons at the ready. As Carlo hit the ground, he found scores of the undead in front and to both sides, all of them pressing into the breach. He didn't pause, but simply lowered his automatic shotgun and fired round after round into them to clear a path. The other 5 did the same, and as creatures fell, they took a step forward. Though space was being created in the front, creatures still tried to overwhelm them from the sides. The Marines following poured fire from their rifles and carbines into this mass, and through sheer weight of bullets, they reduced the numbers enough to get up to the breach.
"Come on!"
shouted Carlo, as he slung his shotgun and moved to use his mace and small shield. A group of creatures pushed him to the right, but Talia pushed back, keeping him steady. He had already taken a few bites to his armor, but it was holding. A quick swing of the shield created a little space, and he followed it up with a heavy strike with his mace. One more step and he was at the barricade. He continued to swing his weapon, whilst Reiner and Talia rushed in to protect his flanks. One of the zombies managed to reach the second line and dragged Ken to the ground. Though his armor saved him from the initial bites, it couldn't help him from being buried under the weight of yet more of them. Ian rushed in, swinging his machete and reaching down, trying to pull Ken to safety. Talia moved close to Carlo, helping to protect each other with their weapons and shields. Carlo shouted whilst pushing forward.
"We have to keep moving forward! We need to reach the causeway!"
he shouted as he stepped inside and struck down another of the creatures.
"We need to help clear this breach or they'll retake it!" cried Vea as she tried to fight off the creatures, closing in from their left side and rear. The gunfire from the wave of follow-up Marines was helping, but even they couldn't stop all of the creatures from making it to the breach.
A gap had developed between the two groups, as scores more of the undead arrived from the causeway and swarmed around the perimeter to the second breach. Carlo turned around to see the danger of their situation. Until the causeway was cleared, the horde would continue to pour around their flank and towards this breach. Though a good number were undoubtedly fighting along the barricades, it was this secondary breach that could provide an easy way in for the creatures. Inside the base, he could see a number of civilians rushing towards them, obviously hoping to help push back the undead.
"Okay, 30 seconds, then we can leave,"
he shouted as he turned and locked himself down firmly in the middle of the breach and facing outwards. Reiner, Talia, Ian, and Vaya joined him in the small block of armor and weapons. The horde crashed into them, and with mechanical efficiency they cut, smashed, and hacked their way at the oncoming tide of creatures. Vaya was thrown back to the ground, but Talia stepped in her place, swinging her shield to smash back the creature that they had reached their position. Another pair of hands reached out, grabbing her shield and ripping it away. A shotgun barrel appeared next to her face, held by the now standing Vaya, who pushed it forward and emptied both barrels. The sound at this distance was deafening, but it cleared the area in front of them. Almost half of those approaching them were cut down by the second wave of Marines, but it wasn't enough. Carlo tried to decide what to do. He needed to leave, but if they turned their backs, they'd be overrun in seconds. The help from inside had arrived, but even their modest numbers weren't enough to give them the time they needed. Then the second hovercraft hit the perimeter. Either by accident or design, they plowed through the creatures and smashed directly into the barrier, tearing down a chunk before coming to a stop.
"Get back!"
shouted Vaya as she pulled them back from the breach. As they fell back inside the compound, a mighty roar from the heavy machine guns on the second craft tore a swath through the horde. The hovercraft had made its way inside the wall and arrived just meters from the breach. With the second wave of Marines jumping out, they rushed in to seal the breach from the inside and started to push back the creatures. As the smoke cleared, an injured Ken dragged himself clear of the bodies and into the campground. Talia knelt down, checking for wounds.
"Did they get you?"
she asked with a hint of both concern and dread.
"I'm okay. A couple of them landed on me. I think one of them broke my leg. I'll take it from here. You keep going,"
he said as he lifted himself into the seated position. Carlo patted him on the shoulder, relieved to have not suffered yet another pointless casualty. He turned to the other four.
"Okay, you've got this. We're heading for the causeway. Come on," he shouted.
The small group, bloodied and exhausted, didn't hesitate as they staggered off along the inside of the barricades where the defenders were desperately trying to hold back the growing numbers of creatures attempting to break through. As they ran, Carlo slid his mace into a holder and pulled out his 1911 automatic. It was a solid, reliable weapon that he had modified and improved over the years. It wasn't as fancy as some of the gear the other Marines had picked up, but it had saved his life on more than one occasion. As they ran up to the barricade, he took note of over a dozen civilians, all wearing improvised protective gear and a mixture of hand weapons and crossbows. It wasn't much. At the barricade there were multiple gaps and scores of hands and heads could be seen trying to work their way inside. Without pausing, he pulled back the slide and fired shot after shot into the heads of the closest creatures. Once he reached the wall itself, he slammed in another magazine and fired literally less than a meter from the creatures' heads, and he knocked down one after the other. The other four lifted themselves up onto the fighting steps and used their firearms and close-quarter weapons and did what they could to help. Part of the barricade was already tearing open, and from the breach poured in more creatures. Two of the defenders were trampled down as the horde piled in, Part of the fighting platform collapsed as the section of the wall gave way, and Reiner fell down into waiting hands. Talia and Vea jumped down, swinging their blades and pushing hard with their shields as they tried to hold back the tide. A great blast like a demon's howl came from the left, and Talia pointed out towards a large gray shape rushing down the narrow waterway and towards the causeway. "Holy shit! It's the captain!" shouted Vea, as the vessel rushed past at what must have been almost 30 knots. The waterway was only double the width of the vessel, and the wake threw water along both sides as it rushed past. On the deck they could see the captain and the small group of Marines firing the heavy weapons at both sides of the water. The undead in the gap between the breached wall and the water were shredded, a long burst of machine gun fire as the vessel sped past. "Get down!" shouted Carlo as he jumped away from the barricade. There was a mighty crashing sound as the small ship slowed as it hit the shallower water and started to grind along the surface. Almost simultaneously, the heavy weapons on the bow opened up on the causeway and the debris that blocked it. At first, the heavy machine guns simply tore the undead apart and took chunks out of the earth, but then the automatic cannon started. With just a few rounds of high explosive ammunition, the debris was blown apart and the water started to flow more freely. As the water rushed through the newly cleared causeway, the undead became trapped on both sides of the water. The vessel had now slowed to a halt and was grounded about 50 meters from the connecting landmass. With it halted the Marines on board, opened fire with every weapon they had against the targets on both sides of the water. In just seconds, hundreds were shredded. "Hell yeah!" shouted one of the defenders as they rushed up to the breach and fought the remaining undead in one last push. Carlo and the rest of the Marines waited, and within 30 seconds they had cleared the last few that were trapped on their side of the water. The cutter slowed as it steamed off to the right, but its work had been done. As the pitiful number of surviving undead lifted themselves up, the jubilant defenders rushed amongst them, easily finishing them off on the ground. As the butchering continued, the first wave of Marines arrived from the second breach and joined in with the clearing. Carlo stopped for a moment, regaining his breath before looking to the filthy but happy defender stood next to him. Carlo grinned, but was too tired and too surprised to have anything useful to say. Before he could come up with something, another loud blast from the left signaled the arrival of the Harper's Ferry as she came closer to the shore. The man lifted out his hand, shaking Carlo's. "The name's Dillon. Welcome to Resolution Island." "Man, could you have timed that any closer?" he said before stepping up and grabbing Carlo around the shoulders. "No problem," said Carlo as he started to laugh. The two stepped down as the rest of the Marines and more of the civilian defenders arrived. More blasts came from the left, though, this time. It sounded like a different vessel. Vea jumped down from the barricade with a beaming grin. "It's the Moreau. They must have hauled ass to get here this fast," she cried. One of the island's defenders stepped forward and towards Carlo, who shook his hand. "Sergeant Parisi of the United States Marine Corps, and I'm damn glad to be here." "You can call me Bruce. I'm the military leader of this place, and you are all very, very welcome to be here." Another series of horns blared as more of the vessels appeared on the horizon, and for the first time it looked like the flotilla and Resolution Island might have a fighting chance. This has been Zombie Dawn Apocalypse of the Zombie Dawn Trilogy, written by Michael G. Thomas and Nick S. Thomas, narrated by Mark Diamond. Copyright 2010 by Michael G. Thomas and Nick S. Thomas. Production copyright 2015 by Swordworks Books.